My wife slammed divorce papers onto my desk right in front of my entire warehouse crew. She was wearing a designer dress, bought with the very money I bled to give her. Just 24 hours earlier, I had drained my retirement account, swallowing a massive tax penalty to pay off her $91,000 debt and save her from going to jail. She stood there smirking, absolutely certain my boss was on her side and that I was about to be escorted out of the building by security. She had it all figured out until my boss locked the glass office doors, tapped the intercom microphone, and said, "Listen carefully." The voice that echoed through the warehouse speakers was not mine, and it was not his. It was her lover's voice bragging about the ultimate betrayal. I want you to hold on to that moment, because getting there nearly broke me. My name is Calvin Hayes. I am 62 years old, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. If you are watching this, grab a cup of coffee and settle in, because the story I am about to tell you is a hard lesson in blind trust. I am a regional logistics manager. That is a fancy title for a man who has spent 35 years of his life breathing in the thick dust of distribution centers and managing chaotic freight lines. My life has been built on the rumble of 18-wheelers backing into loading docks and the smell of diesel fuel lingering on my clothes. I have worked 60-hour weeks for longer than I can remember. My knees pop every time I stand up, and my lower back feels like it is permanently on fire. I grew up with nothing, and I promised myself early on that I would work my hands to the bone so my family would never know the struggle I knew. I believed in the old-school American dream. You work hard, you provide, and you protect your own. That was my religion. Every morning I was up at 4:30 in the dark, brewing cheap coffee and lacing up my steel toe boots. I did not complain. I took pride in being the man who kept the wheels turning. I took pride in being the man people could rely on. But more than anything, I took pride in being the provider for my home. For 20 years, my absolute devotion belonged to my wife, Brenda. She is 58, a white woman, who always had a taste for the finer things in life. When we met, I was captivated by her charm and her energy. I wanted to give her the world. I thought a real man shows his love by what he can provide, by the comfort he can secure for his family. When Brenda told me she wanted to open a high-end floral boutique in a trendy part of town, I did not hesitate. I wanted her to have a passion project, something that made her feel fulfilled. I pulled extra shifts I took on weekend consulting jobs, and I funded the whole operation from the ground up. I remember the day we signed the lease. I paid for the expensive storefront, I bought the imported glass vases, I covered the marketing campaigns, and I paid the contractors to install custom lighting. It cost a small fortune, but seeing her name painted in elegant gold letters on that window made it all worth it. I did it because seeing her happy made my grueling 60-hour work weeks bearable. I thought she was busy running a successful business. I thought we were building a beautiful life together. I thought my unwavering devotion was matched by her loyalty. I was completely and utterly blind to the reality of who I was married to. The illusion I had built my entire life around shattered on a random Tuesday night. It had been a brutal day at the warehouse. We had 3 delayed shipments, a broken forklift, and a crew that was exhausted from working overtime. I came home bone-tired, smelling like sweat and cardboard, just wanting a hot shower and a quiet meal. The house was usually perfectly staged, like something out of a magazine. But that night, the energy felt heavy the moment I walked through the door. I was sitting in my worn-out leather recliner, rubbing my aching knees and trying to find the energy to take off my boots when the front door burst open. Brenda did not just walk in, she stumbled in. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, like she was drowning. Her expensive designer purse dropped to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, spilling her keys and makeup everywhere. Her face was pale, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black streaks. She collapsed onto the expensive living room rug, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. Her whole body was shaking. I had never seen her like this in our entire 20 years of marriage. I jumped up, ignoring the sharp shooting pain in my legs, and rushed over to her. I dropped to my knees beside her and pulling her trembling body into my arms. I asked her what was wrong, who had hurt her, what happened. She could barely speak between her gasps for air. Her fingers dug into my work shirt, clinging to me like a lifeline. "Calvin," she choked out, her voice raw and broken. "Calvin, I ruined everything. I am so sorry. I messed up so badly." My mind immediately went to the darkest places. I thought maybe someone had died. I thought she had been in a terrible car accident. But what came out of her mouth next was a different kind of disaster, one that would tear the foundation of my life apart. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute terror, and confessed that her boutique had not been making a profit for over a year. She admitted that she had been hiding the eviction notices from the landlord. She had been hiding the unpaid vendor bills, stuffing them in the back of her desk drawer. But that was not the worst part. She told me that to keep the doors open and maintain the illusion of success to her friends, she had borrowed money. She did not go to a bank. She said her credit was ruined from maxing out credit cards I did not know about, so she went to a private lender. A shady private lender who did not play by the rules. She looked me in the eye and confessed that she had borrowed $91,000. My heart stopped beating for a full second. The blood drained from my face. $91,000. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. It was not just a number. For a working man like me, $91,000 is years of sweat. It is years of waking up in the freezing cold before the sun comes up. It is missed holidays and skipped vacations. It was the safety net I had painstakingly built in my retirement account so I could finally rest at 65. She grabbed my hands, her grip tight and desperate. Her nails dug into my calloused skin. She told me the lender was demanding full payment by Friday. If she did not hand over $91,000 by Friday, they were going to seize our home. They had threatened to press criminal fraud charges against her because she had falsified our joint financial documents to secure the money. "Calvin, I am going to go to jail," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "They are going to take the house and they are going to lock me up in a cell. You have to help me. You have to save me. Please do not let them take me away." I sat there on the floor of our beautiful home, feeling the weight of the world crashing down on my shoulders. I looked at the imported furniture, the expensive art on the walls, the life I had killed myself to provide. It was all built on lies. I felt a flash of intense anger. How could she do this? How could she forge my name and risk everything we owned just to keep up appearances? But looking at my wife trembling and sobbing on the floor, looking at the woman I had sworn to protect, my anger was swallowed by my duty. My protector instinct overrode every logical thought in my brain. I had been dreaming of that retirement. I had been dreaming of finally resting my bad knees, of waking up without an alarm clock, of sitting on the back porch and just watching the morning roll in without a care in the world. But I could not let her go to prison. I could not let us lose the house I had worked so hard to pay for. I wiped the dark tears from her face. I looked her straight in the eyes, and I told her what I thought a good husband was supposed to say. I pushed down my own fear and my own exhaustion. I told her I would fix it. I told her I would take care of it. I told her not to worry anymore, because I had her back, and I would not let anyone take her away. I promised to make the nightmare stop, even if it meant sacrificing my own future. I held her while she cried, her tears soaking into my work shirt. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to pull together that kind of cash in less than 3 days. I had some savings, but nowhere near $91,000 in liquid cash. The only place I had that kind of money was in my retirement account. The account I had been feeding a little bit every month for 35 years. The account that was supposed to be my reward for a lifetime of heavy lifting. Taking money out of that account early meant severe financial penalties. It meant taxes would eat up a huge chunk of it. It meant I would have to work well into my 70s just to recover from the blow. I looked at my hands. They were rough, scarred, and tired. I was 62 years old. My body was telling me it was time to slow down, but my heart was telling me I had to step up one more time. I thought about our wedding day 20 years ago. I thought about the vows I made before God and our family to have and to hold for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. I took those words seriously. I believed that a marriage was a partnership where you carry the weight when your partner stumbles. I truly believed she had just made a terrible, desperate mistake out of fear of disappointing me. I thought she was crying because she felt guilty for failing. I gently pulled her away and looked her in the eyes. I told her to go upstairs and take a warm shower. I told her to try and get some sleep. I sat alone in the living room for a long time after she went upstairs. The house was dead quiet, but my mind was deafening. I pulled out my phone and looked at my retirement account balance. It took me 35 years to build it up, and it was going to take one phone call to tear it down. I felt a heavy knot in my chest, a physical ache that went deeper than my tired bones. I knew this decision was going to set me back a decade. But I convinced myself that money could be remade. A marriage, a home, a wife's freedom, those were things you could not put a price tag on. I made the decision right then and there. I would make the call in the morning. I would drain the account. I would pay the shady lender, and we would start over. I went to sleep that night on the couch, carrying the heavy burden of a provider, completely unaware that the real nightmare had not even begun. The sun had not even thought about rising over the Atlanta skyline when I opened my eyes. I was still lying on the living room sofa wearing the same work clothes from the day before. The fabric of my shirt felt stiff and smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and cardboard dust from the distribution center. My back screamed in protest as I pushed myself up into a sitting position. Every joint in my body popped a harsh reminder of my 62 years on this earth and the physical toll of a lifetime spent in logistics. But the pain in my bones was nothing compared to the heavy, crushing weight sitting right on top of my chest. On the glass coffee table, sitting next to a cold mug of coffee from last night, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. It had a routing number and an account number scribbled on it in my wife's frantic handwriting. That tiny piece of paper represented the end of everything I had worked for. I sat there in the quiet dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For 35 years, I had been a provider. I had unloaded freight trailers in the sweltering Georgia summer heat. I had managed dispatch boards during winter ice storms when nobody else wanted to come into the warehouse. I missed birthdays, I missed barbecues, and I pushed my body past its limits, all to build a safety net. My retirement account was my pride and joy. It was the absolute proof that a kid who grew up with nothing could carve out a piece of the American dream through sheer willpower and honest labor. That account was my finish line. It meant that in 3 years, I could hang up my hard hat, turn in my clipboard, and finally rest. It meant sitting on a porch somewhere feeling the breeze instead of the blast of an 18-wheeler air horn. Now I was going to wipe it out in a single morning. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the faucet, splashing freezing water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane. I looked old. The deep lines around my mouth and the gray in my beard told the story of a man who had carried the world on his shoulders. But a man protects his house. A man protects his wife. That was the code I lived by. Brenda was terrified she was going to prison. She was sobbing on this very floor, just a few hours ago, begging me to save her from the private lenders who were supposedly coming for our home. I could not let her face that kind of terror. I could not let the woman I loved be dragged out of our front door in handcuffs. I dried my face, grabbed my cell phone, and waited for the clock to hit 8 in the morning. The second the clock struck 8, I dialed the number for my financial advisor. His name was David, and he had managed my portfolio for over a decade. He knew how hard I worked for every single dollar in that fund. When he answered, his voice was cheerful, completely unaware that I was about to drop a bomb on my own life. I took a deep breath and told him I needed to liquidate my entire 401k immediately. There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him shuffling papers in his office. "Calvin," he finally said, his tone dropping into a serious, professional panic. "You cannot do this. You are 62. If we liquidate the entire account right now, you are going to trigger massive early withdrawal penalties. The taxes alone are going to obliterate 30% of your money right off the top. This is financial suicide, my friend. You will be starting over from scratch." I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. "I know, David," I said, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "I know exactly what it costs, but it is an absolute emergency. I need $91,000 wired to a specific routing number by the end of business today." David pushed back hard. He spent the next 20 minutes trying to talk me out of it. He offered alternatives. He suggested taking out a smaller personal loan. He advised me to leverage the equity in the house. He practically begged me to reconsider, telling me that whatever emergency I was facing could not possibly be worth destroying 35 years of financial security. But I shut him down. I told him there was no time for bank approvals or home equity processing. The deadline was Friday. The threat was immediate. I told him to authorize the liquidation and process the wire transfer. I listened to his heavy sigh through the receiver before he finally agreed to send over the digital authorization forms. When the email chimed on my phone, I opened the secure document. I stared at the screen for a long time. The forms required my electronic signature to confirm that I understood the severe financial penalties and the massive tax burden I was bringing upon myself. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing I had to jump to save the person standing behind me. I typed in my name and hit submit. Then I copied the routing number and account number Brenda had written on that crumpled piece of paper and pasted them into the transfer destination field. My finger hovered over the confirm button. My heart hammered against my ribs. In one digital click, my entire future was gone. I pressed the button. The screen loaded for a second, and then flashed a bright green check mark indicating the wire transfer was successfully initiated and the funds were in transit. It was done. I was essentially broke. The safety net was gone. But I felt a strange sense of relief washing over me. I had done my job. I had saved my family. I had shielded my wife from the consequences of her terrible business mistakes. I made a fresh pot of coffee, feeling a strange mixture of pride and profound exhaustion. I waited for Brenda to come downstairs so I could give her the news. I expected her to run into my arms. I expected her to cry tears of joy and relief. I expected us to sit at the kitchen table, hold hands, and figure out how we were going to rebuild our lives together. About 30 minutes later, I heard her footsteps on the hardwood stairs. I turned around, leaning against the kitchen counter, holding my coffee mug. She walked into the kitchen fully dressed. But she was not wearing sweatpants or a robe like a woman who had just spent the entire night hyperventilating in terror. She was wearing a crisp, tailored designer blouse, a perfect pair of slacks, and expensive heels. Her hair was flawlessly styled and her makeup was impeccably done. There was absolutely no trace of the broken, terrified woman who had been collapsing on the living room rug just a few hours prior. I looked at her, completely taken aback by her appearance. "Brenda," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I did it. I called the broker. I drained the account and wired the $91,000 to the routing number you gave me. The money is gone. You are safe. They are not going to take the house and nobody is going to press any charges against you. It is over." I waited for the reaction. I waited for the overwhelming gratitude. But what happened next defied every single law of human nature. There was no sigh of relief. There was no breakdown of emotion. There was absolutely no gratitude. Brenda stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at me. Her expression was completely blank. Her eyes, which had been wide with panic the night before, were now totally flat and lifeless. The atmosphere in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The air became thick and heavy, ice cold and suffocating. She did not rush over to hug me. She did not thank me for giving up my life savings. She simply looked down at her polished fingernails and gave a brief, indifferent nod. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady, flat, and completely devoid of any emotion. "Good. I am glad that is handled." I stood there, frozen, my coffee mug halfway to my mouth. I could not comprehend what I was seeing. My brain struggled to process the sheer disconnect between the catastrophic sacrifice I had just made and the chilling apathy radiating from the woman standing in front of me. I had just set my own future on fire to keep her warm, and she reacted as if I had merely told her I took the trash out to the curb. Before I could even find the words to ask her what was wrong, she walked past me and headed straight for the hall closet. She opened the door and pulled out a sleek leather overnight bag. She carried it back into the kitchen and set it on the granite counter, completely ignoring the stunned expression on my face. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you going?" She zipped up the overnight bag and slung the strap over her shoulder. She did not even look me in the eye when she answered. "I need to get away for a few days," she said, her tone casual and dismissive. "The stress of this whole debt situation has been absolutely toxic for my mental health. I cannot breathe in this house right now. I booked a weekend stress relief retreat up in the mountains to clear my head and find my center again. I will be back on Sunday." I stared at her, feeling a cold knot of dread forming in the absolute pit of my stomach. A stress relief retreat. I had just bankrupted my entire retirement, taking a massive 30% penalty to save her from going to federal prison, and her immediate reaction was to pack a luxury overnight bag and head to a mountain resort to clear her head. It made absolutely no logical sense. Women who are drowning in debt and facing the loss of their home do not book expensive weekend getaways the exact moment their husband bails them out. "Brenda," I said, stepping forward, my confusion slowly morphing into a deep, unsettling alarm. "You are leaving right now. We just lost our entire life savings. We need to sit down and talk about how we are going to manage our finances moving forward. We need to figure out how to rebuild. You cannot just pack a bag and leave." She finally looked at me, and the coldness in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "Calvin, do not smother me," she snapped, her voice laced with sudden irritation. "I told you I cannot handle this energy right now. I need space. You handled the money just like you said you would. Now let me handle my peace of mind. I will see you on Sunday." Without another word, she turned on her expensive heel and walked out the front door. I stood in the kitchen, completely paralyzed, listening to the sharp click of the door shutting behind her. I heard the electronic chirp of her unlocking her luxury sport utility vehicle. I heard the powerful engine roar to life. I walked slowly into the living room and looked out the front window. I watched her sleek black vehicle reverse out of the driveway and speed off down the quiet suburban street, disappearing around the corner. The silence she left behind in the house was deafening. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a bomb goes off. I stood alone by the window, my hands trembling slightly, my heart pounding with a sickening, intuitive rhythm. I had spent 35 years learning how to read people in the logistics business. I knew when a supplier was lying to me about a delayed shipment. I knew when a driver was hiding a mechanical issue. My gut had never steered me wrong. And right now, my gut was screaming at me. I replayed the last 12 hours in my mind over and over again. The hysterical crying on the floor. The immediate demand for $91,000. The specific routing number ready to go. And then, the instant the money was wired, the miraculous recovery. The perfectly styled hair. The designer clothes. The pre-packed overnight bag. The swift, remorseless exit. My sacrifice was not met with love. It was met with an escape. I had thrown my entire life savings into a roaring fire expecting to save my wife. But as I stood there watching her taillights vanish into the morning mist, the horrific realization began to wash over me. She had not been crying out of terror the night before. She had been putting on a performance, and I, like an absolute fool, had played my part perfectly. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the crumpled piece of paper sitting on the counter. The paper with the routing number. The destination of my 35 years of blood, sweat, and tears. A dark, heavy suspicion settled over my chest, tightening like a vice. I did not know where my money had actually gone. I did not know where my wife was actually going. But I knew one thing with absolute bone-chilling certainty. The woman I had loved and protected for 20 years had just played me for a fool, and my nightmare was only just beginning. The morning sun crept through the expensive custom blinds of our living room, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat completely motionless in my worn leather recliner, holding a mug of coffee that had gone ice cold an hour ago. The silence in the house was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of quiet that follows a devastating storm. My wife of 20 years had just walked out the door with a designer overnight bag, leaving me alone in the ruins of my financial future. I had drained 35 years of my sweat, my bad back, my missed holidays, and my ruined knees into a wire transfer to save her from a prison sentence. And she had thanked me by running off to a mountain retreat to clear her head. I was physically exhausted, but my mind was running at 1,000 miles an hour. Every instinct I had developed over 3 decades in the logistics business was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I had spent my life managing complex supply chains, identifying weak links in massive warehouse operations, and anticipating disasters before they happened. You do not survive in my line of work by being naive. You survive by reading the data and trusting your gut. My gut was telling me that I had just been played, but I still could not comprehend the scale of the game. The sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone shattered the dead silence of the living room. I flinched, nearly dropping the cold mug. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone. The caller identification displayed a toll-free number with the name of my primary banking institution. I frowned, staring at the screen. It was barely 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. I swiped my thumb across the glass and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, this is Calvin," I answered, my voice rough and gravelly from a night entirely devoid of sleep. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. My name is Robert, and I am calling from the Fraud Prevention and Risk Management Department at the corporate office. I am contacting you regarding a high-value wire transfer initiated from your primary checking account earlier this morning. For your security, I need to verify some information before we process this transaction." I rubbed my tired eyes, feeling a surge of frustration. "Robert, I authorized that transfer manually just an hour ago. I spoke with my wealth advisor and went through all the security protocols. I signed the digital release forms myself. The funds need to be released today. It is an extremely time-sensitive emergency. I completely understand, Mr. Hayes, the representative replied, his tone maintaining that unnerving, professional calm. We see the authorization and the electronic signatures on our end. The transaction is not being held due to a lack of authorization. It was flagged by our automated anti-money laundering system due to a severe discrepancy in the receiving account details. I sat up straight in the recliner. The fatigue in my bones vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. What kind of discrepancy? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. Mr. Hayes, you indicated on the internal authorization forms that this wire transfer was to settle a commercial debt with a private lending institution. However, the routing and account numbers you provided do not belong to a commercial entity, a business trust, or any registered lending corporation. My brow furrowed. I looked over at the kitchen counter where the crumpled piece of paper with Brenda's frantic handwriting still lay next to the sink. What exactly are you saying, Robert? Where is my money trying to go? The bank representative paused for a second, and I could hear the faint clicking of a computer keyboard through the receiver. The destination you provided is a standard domestic personal checking account. Furthermore, our system flagged it because this specific account was opened less than 14 days ago. Sending $91,000 to a newly established personal checking account triggers an automatic federal hold. We need your verbal confirmation that you personally know the individuals on the receiving end before we release these funds. The air in my living room suddenly felt dangerously thin. My chest tightened as if an invisible iron band had just wrapped around my ribs. The narrative Brenda had sold me, the hysterical sobbing on the floor, the threats of property seizure, the ruthless private lenders preparing to throw her in a federal holding cell, it was all unraveling at blinding speed. Individuals. I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You said individuals plural. Who owns that account, Robert? Read me the exact names registered to that routing number right now. There was another brief pause. I can confirm the primary account holders, Mr. Hayes. It is a joint personal checking account registered to a Brenda Hayes and a Derek Mitchell. The phone nearly slipped out of my calloused hand. The room started to spin, pulling me into a dizzying, suffocating vortex. Brenda Hayes. My wife. She had given me a routing number to her own hidden bank account. But the second name was the one that drove a rusted spike directly through my heart. Derek Mitchell. I knew exactly who Derek Mitchell was. My mind violently snapped back to a Tuesday evening about 6 months ago. Brenda had invited a guest over for a catered dinner at our house. She told me she needed a highly aggressive commercial real estate broker to renegotiate the lease for her floral boutique. She claimed her current landlord was trying to squeeze her out of the trendy downtown district, and she needed a shark to fight back. That shark was Derek Mitchell. I remembered him standing in my kitchen drinking my expensive scotch. He was a slick 30-something guy with perfectly styled hair, a tailored suit that cost more than my first car, and leather loafers worn without socks. He wore an aggressive amount of cologne that lingered in the air long after he left the room. He had this arrogant, brilliant white smile that never reached his eyes. All evening, he had called me sir with a subtle underlying tone of mockery, as if he were addressing a tired old servant rather than the master of the house. I had sat at the head of my own dining table listening to him boast about his real estate conquests, while Brenda looked at him with an intensity I had not seen in a decade. I had paid that man a $5,000 retainer fee to help my wife. I had shaken his hand. I had thanked him for looking out for her business. And now my life savings, $91,000 of my blood, my destroyed back, my youth, my sacrificed retirement was sitting in a joint checking account belonging to my wife and that arrogant, overly cologned child. Mr. Hayes, the bank representative asked, his voice breaking through the roaring static in my ears. Are you still on the line, sir? Do you recognize these individuals and do you wish to proceed with the wire transfer to this personal account? I closed my eyes. The level of betrayal was so absolute, so deeply evil, that for a brief moment I thought I might actually have a heart attack right there in the recliner. She did not just cheat on me. She weaponized my love for her. She weaponized my instinct to protect my family. She looked me directly in the eyes, produced fake hysterical tears, and manipulated me into bankrupting my entire future so she could fund a new life with a man half my age. The stress relief mountain retreat she was currently driving to was not a solo trip to clear her head. It was a romantic celebration. They were probably toasting with champagne right now, laughing at the tired old warehouse manager who just handed them his life savings. A violent, explosive rage flared up in my chest. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to throw my phone against the brick fireplace and smash it into 100 pieces. I wanted to get into my truck, track the GPS on her luxury sport utility vehicle, drag Derek Mitchell out of whatever resort bed he was sleeping in, and show him exactly what 35 years of heavy lifting does to a man's hands. But then the logistics manager inside me took over. I had spent my entire adult life navigating high-pressure environments. When a supply chain breaks down violently, you do not panic. You do not throw a tantrum, and you do not burn down the warehouse. You isolate the bad link, you secure the perimeter, and you systematically dismantle the problem without letting the opposing side know you have changed the operational strategy. If I exploded right now, if I called Brenda and unleashed my fury, she would know she was caught. She would spin a new web of lies. She would claim it was a legitimate business account. She would hide her tracks, delete her messages, and I would be locked in a chaotic, she said, legal battle with no concrete proof of the affair or the extortion. I needed undeniable, absolute proof. I needed to let her believe she had won, so she would get sloppy. I needed her to bring that car back to my driveway. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I opened my eyes and stared at the empty kitchen counter where she had packed her bag. Robert, I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. I recognize the names. It is a legitimate business trust account established for my wife's commercial lease negotiation. The funds are for a corporate real estate transaction. Please release the hold and authorize the wire transfer immediately. Understood, Mr. Hayes. The fraud alert has been cleared. The funds will be fully available in their joint account within the hour. Thank you for banking with us. Have a safe day. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the glass coffee table. I had just willingly handed $91,000 to my wife's lover. It went against every fiber of my being, every ounce of my pride, and every masculine instinct in my body. It felt like swallowing broken glass, but I knew it was the only way to spring the trap. By releasing the money, I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves. I was officially funding their destruction. I sat in the quiet house for another hour, meticulously building my strategy. I needed to control the narrative. I needed to play the role of the clueless, exhausted husband who was simply grateful he could save his wife from imaginary thugs. I picked up my phone, opened my messaging application, and stared at Brenda's contact name. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. My hands were shaking, not from sorrow, but from a cold, calculated fury. I typed out a message, crafting every word to sound exactly like the man she thought she had successfully manipulated. Just got confirmation from the bank. The money went through perfectly. The debt is completely wiped out, baby. You are safe. I hope the drive up to the mountains was peaceful. Take all the time you need to breathe and find your center this weekend. Do not worry about anything back here. I love you. I hit send and watched the little green bubble pop onto the screen. I felt physically sick writing those words, but I knew it was the perfect bait. Less than 5 minutes later, 3 small gray dots appeared on the screen indicating she was typing a reply. I stared at the phone, my jaw clenched so tight, my teeth ached. The response came through short, dismissive, and dripping with fake affection. Thank God. You have no idea how much weight just lifted off my chest. You really saved me, Calvin. The cabin is beautiful and so quiet. I am going to turn my phone off for the rest of the weekend to just meditate and heal. See you Sunday night. I locked the screen of my phone and set it down. Meditate and heal. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was turning her phone off so the old man would not interrupt her weekend with her young real estate broker. She thought she was holding all the cards. She thought she had outsmarted a man who built his entire career on catching people in a lie. I stood up from the recliner, ignoring the pain in my lower back. The sorrow was completely gone. The heartbroken husband, who had sobbed with his wife on the rug last night, was dead and buried. The man standing in the living room now was a regional manager facing a hostile takeover. I walked into the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the stainless steel sink, and looked out the window at the empty driveway. I was going to let her enjoy her weekend. I was going to let her sip expensive wine and laugh at my expense. But when she brought that luxury vehicle back to my house on Sunday night, I was going to tear her absolute world apart. She thought I was blind. She thought I was just a walking checkbook. But she had forgotten one crucial detail. I bought that luxury SUV for her last year. And when I bought it, I personally hardwired a high-definition dual-lens dash camera into the rearview mirror housing, a camera that recorded not just the road, but the entire interior of the cabin. A camera that backed up every single audio conversation to a hidden micro-digital secure digital card. I just had to wait for Sunday. The weekend crawled by like a fully loaded freight train dragging a blown tire. I spent Saturday pacing the hardwood floors of our home, cleaning the kitchen counters until they gleamed and staring at the clock on the wall. Every single minute felt like a grueling hour. I had to mentally prepare myself for the performance of a lifetime. I had spent decades leading warehouse crews, managing hundreds of men, resolving heated disputes, and keeping a level head when supply chains completely collapsed. Now I had to use every ounce of that hard-earned discipline just to look my wife in the eye without demanding the absolute truth. Sunday evening finally arrived. The low mechanical hum of the garage door opening sent a jolt of raw electricity straight down my spine. I stood in the middle of the living room, smoothing out the wrinkles in my shirt, taking one last deep breath to bury the burning suspicion deep inside my chest. Brenda walked through the door carrying her designer overnight bag. She looked absolutely radiant. Her skin had a fresh, healthy glow, her shoulders were perfectly relaxed, and she carried the aura of a woman who had not a single care in the entire world. This was the exact same woman who just days prior was curled into a tight ball on the rug, gasping for air and begging me to save her from a federal prison sentence. She dropped her heavy leather bag by the console table and let out a long, dramatic sigh. "Oh, Calvin," she said, her voice dripping with artificial peace. The mountain air was exactly what I needed. I feel so incredibly centered. I feel like I can finally breathe again. Thank you so much for taking care of that awful financial mess. I walked over and gently took her coat from her hands. I forced my facial muscles to form a gentle, relieved smile. "I am just glad you are safe," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even and steady. "I told you I would protect you, and I meant it. You just focus on moving forward and healing." She offered me a tight, closed lip smile that did not even remotely reach her eyes. She gave my arm a quick, dismissive pat. "You are a good man, Calvin," she murmured, before walking past me toward the kitchen to pour herself a tall glass of chilled wine. She acted as if we were mere roommates passing in the hall. There was no lingering guilt, no residual trauma from her supposed brush with dangerous loan sharks. She was entirely, completely detached. We ate dinner in near silence. I asked polite surface-level questions about her retreat, and she gave vague, rehearsed answers about meditation circles and nature walks. I nodded along, chewing my food mechanically, while the alarm bells in my head deafened me. I waited hours for the house to fall completely silent. Around midnight, the soft, rhythmic breathing from her side of the bed confirmed she was deeply asleep. I slipped out from under the heavy covers, moving with the practiced quiet of a man who used to wake up at 3 a.m. for early warehouse shifts. I put on my slippers, grabbed my laptop from the home office, and made my way down the dark hallway. The floorboards felt freezing against my feet, but the chill running through my blood was much worse. I opened the door to the garage. The familiar heavy scent of motor oil and expensive leather greeted me. Sitting right in the center of the concrete floor was the luxury sport utility vehicle I had purchased for her 50th birthday. I had worked back-to-back weekend shifts for an entire year to pay that vehicle off in cash. I wanted her to feel safe on the road. I wanted her to have the absolute best. And because I wanted her to be secure, I had personally installed a high-definition dual-lens dash camera right behind the rearview mirror. It recorded the road ahead, but it also had an inward-facing lens and a highly sensitive microphone designed to capture the cabin interior for security purposes. Brenda never paid attention to technology. To her, it was just another piece of black plastic on the windshield. I opened the driver's side door, wincing slightly, as the hinges let out a soft, metallic creak. The interior dome light illuminated the spotless, cream leather seats. I reached up behind the mirror, pressed the small release tab, and popped out the micro-digital secure memory card. It was no bigger than my fingernail, but holding it in my palm felt like carrying 100 pounds of lead. I walked over to my heavy wooden workbench in the corner of the garage. I set my laptop down, booted it up, and inserted the memory card into the side port. The blue screen illuminated my face, casting a harsh, pale glare in the pitch-black garage. I opened the file directory. There were dozens of video and audio files meticulously organized by date and time stamps. I scrolled down to Friday afternoon, the exact time frame she had left our house, supposedly bound for her mountain retreat of healing and isolation. My calloused hand hovered over the trackpad. I knew with absolute certainty that clicking play would irrevocably destroy the last 20 years of my life. There was no going back from what I was about to hear. But a man cannot live his life in the dark. A man has to face the fire even if it burns his world to ash. I double-clicked the file and put my headphones over my ears. The recording started with the sound of the vehicle engine rumbling to life. For a few minutes there was only the hum of the road and the soft playing of the radio. And then the vehicle stopped. The passenger door opened and shut with a heavy, solid thud. "Did you get it?" a male voice asked immediately. It was Derek Mitchell, the slick, arrogant commercial real estate broker. I recognized his fast, overly confident tone the second the words left his mouth. Then came Brenda's voice. She did not sound stressed. She did not sound like a woman fleeing from dangerous debt collectors. She sounded euphoric. She let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed through my headphones, slicing right through my eardrums. "Of course I got it, baby," she cheered. "The entire $91,000 cleared into our joint account an hour ago. He drained his retirement just like we planned. The old fool actually cried when he told me I was safe." I physically recoiled in my chair. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut as a massive wave of intense physical nausea rolled over me. My wife. the woman I had vowed to protect before God and my family. She was actively mocking my tears. She was laughing at the exact moment I threw away my golden years to save her from ruin. Derek let out a long, sharp whistle followed by a deep, satisfied chuckle. "I have to hand it to you, Brenda," he said. "I thought getting him to liquidate his 401k was going to be an uphill battle. You played the terrified victim perfectly. That 91 grand is exactly what I need to secure the commercial lease for my new brokerage firm. We are fully funded. No bank loans, no venture capitalists asking questions. Just one massive clean cash injection from your husband." The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening, terrifying clarity. There was no failing floral boutique debt. There were no shady private lenders threatening to take our house. The entire story, the hysterical tears, the hyperventilating, the sheer panic, it was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Brenda and Derek had fabricated the entire crisis to extract seed money for his new business venture. My 35 years of brutal warehouse labor, my bad back, my swollen knees, all of it was just a convenient funding source for a 30-something kid who wore expensive loafers without socks. I listened to the sound of them kissing, the wet, vile sound of my wife celebrating my absolute financial ruin with another man inside the very car I had worked myself to the bone to buy for her. My chest heaved. I gripped the edge of the wooden workbench so hard my knuckles turned completely white. My blood was not just boiling, it was turning into pure toxic acid. I wanted to rip the laptop in half. I wanted to march upstairs, kick the bedroom door open, and drag her out of my house. But I forced myself to keep the headphones on. I forced myself to listen to every single agonizing second of their treacherous conversation, because the nightmare was not over. They were not done with me yet. As the car merged onto the highway, the conversation shifted from celebration to their future strategy. "So what is the next move?" Derek asked over the sound of the wind rushing past the windows. "You have the money, I have the business set up. When do you drop the hammer on the marriage? We cannot keep sneaking around these mountain resorts forever." Brenda's tone shifted from giddy to cold and ruthlessly calculating. "Do not worry about Calvin," she said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I have the second phase completely figured out. I am not just going to hand him divorce papers at the house. That gives him way too much home field advantage. He might try to fight me for the equity in this property. I need to break his spirit completely." "What exactly are you going to do?" Derek asked, sounding genuinely curious. "I am going to his warehouse next Friday," she stated proudly. "I am going to walk right onto that dusty logistics floor in the middle of his shift. I am going to serve him the divorce papers right in front of his entire crew. Every single forklift driver, every shift supervisor, every blue-collar guy who looks up to him is going to watch me drop those papers on his desk. I am going to accuse him of financial abuse and demand he leave the premises." My heart completely stopped. My jaw locked so tightly my teeth threatened to crack under the pressure. "He is a proud black man," Brenda continued, her voice oozing with wicked satisfaction. "His reputation at that company is his entire identity. If I humiliate him publicly, if I strip him of his dignity in front of the men he leads, he will completely crumble. He hates public scandal. He hates workplace drama. He will be so desperate to make the public shame stop that he will quietly sign over the house to avoid a messy, highly publicized trial. I will get the house, you have your business capital, and Calvin will be left with absolutely nothing." Derek laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that pierced my soul. "You are absolutely ruthless, Brenda. I love it. Let the old man keep his dusty warehouse. We are moving up." The recording faded into the background noise of the highway. I reached up with trembling hands and pulled the headphones off my ears, setting them gently on the wooden workbench. The silence of the garage returned, but the ringing in my head was absolutely deafening. I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the glowing blue screen of the laptop. I did not shed a single tear. The sorrow and the heartbreak had been completely burned away by the sheer magnitude of their evil. The paralyzing grief that had been choking me for days instantly calcified into a cold, razor-sharp fury. Brenda thought I was just a tired old man. She thought because I loved her, I was weak and gullible. She actually believed she could walk onto my warehouse floor, the place where I had earned my respect through decades of blood and sweat, and strip me of my dignity. She thought she had easily outsmarted a regional logistics manager. But she forgot one crucial detail. In the world of logistics, when a massive system fails, you do not surrender to the chaos. You secure the perimeter, you gather your assets, and you execute a counter-operation that leaves the opposing side completely and utterly neutralized. I looked at the laptop screen one last time. I now had the confession. I had the motive, and I had their entire playbook. But I needed a battlefield. If my wife wanted to bring a war to my warehouse on Friday afternoon, I was going to make absolutely certain she never walked out of it the same. The dawn broke on Monday morning, with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the cold stone residing right inside my chest. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the very same table where I had shared thousands of meals with a woman who was actively planning my execution. But I was not crying anymore. Tears are a luxury for the safe, and I was standing completely exposed in the middle of a minefield. My logistics training was running at absolute maximum capacity. When a massive warehouse roof caves in, you do not sit there mourning the loss of the shingles. You secure the remaining inventory, and you brace the support beams. My inventory was my remaining life and my dignity. I pulled out my secure personal laptop and began my silent defense. I had a secondary savings account, a modest emergency fund, and some liquid stock options that Brenda had never paid any attention to because they were not glamorous enough for her lifestyle. I immediately called a trusted financial attorney I had known for 15 years, a man named Silas, who handled discreet legal trusts for high-net-worth clients. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I had moved every single remaining liquid asset into an ironclad, irrevocable trust that Brenda could not legally touch without my explicit signature. I changed every digital password, every security question, and every two-factor authentication code tied to my name. I contacted all 3 major credit bureaus and placed a hard freeze on my social security number, preventing anyone from opening new lines of credit. I was building a digital fortress around my survival. Once the financial perimeter was secured, I thought I had the entire blueprint of their betrayal figured out. I thought the nightmare was fully mapped out in front of me. The young broker Derek wanted my hard-earned cash, and my wife Brenda wanted my paid-off house. It was a classic tragic tale of ordinary greed, but a wise logistics manager always checks the freight manifest twice before clearing the dock. I plugged the hidden memory card back into the computer. I needed to comb through the rest of the Sunday dashcam audio just to be absolutely certain they had not mentioned any specific offshore bank accounts or hidden legal contacts I needed to watch out for. The recording picked up again, about 20 minutes after Brenda had dropped Derek off at his luxury apartment. She was driving her sport utility vehicle back toward our quiet suburban neighborhood. The audio was filled with the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt. Suddenly, the vehicle Bluetooth system chimed loudly. She was making an outgoing phone call. The line rang twice before a gravelly smoker voice answered the connection. It was not Derek. It was Mitch. My stomach instantly tied itself into a sickening knot. Mitch is Brenda's older brother. He is a sleazy white American debt collector who operates his shady business out of a dingy strip mall on the desolate outskirts of town. For 20 years, Mitch has treated me like I was an unwelcome guest in my own home. At Thanksgiving dinners and holiday gatherings, he would drink my good expensive bourbon, sit on my imported leather couch, and make snide, passive-aggressive remarks about how a blue-collar warehouse guy got incredibly lucky marrying into his family. He always looked at me with this subtle, sneering superiority, as if my 35 years of honest, grinding labor were somehow vastly inferior to his predatory hustle of harassing desperate, low-income families for loan companies. I had tolerated his thinly veiled racism and his arrogant disrespect purely out of love for my wife. Now I was listening to him orchestrate my professional funeral. The audio through my laptop speakers was crystal clear. Brenda sounded anxious, but undeniably excited. "Mitch," she said, her voice practically vibrating with energy. "I did it! The money cleared the bank. Derek has the business capital, and I am dropping the divorce papers on Calvin this Friday at the warehouse." I expected her brother to congratulate her. Instead, Mitch let out a harsh, hacking laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. He told her she was playing checkers while she desperately needed to be playing chess. He told her that walking into my warehouse and handing me divorce papers was dramatic and entertaining, but it was strategically flawed. Mr. Hayes, the debt collector, said, using my last name with absolute venom. He is a regional manager with 35 years of spotless employment. He makes a solid 6-figure income. He has a massive corporate legal network through his executive benefits package. If you just divorce him normally, he is going to hire a shark lawyer. He will drag this out in court for years. He will fight you for every square inch of that house, and a judge will look at him as a hard-working innocent victim. You will end up splitting the assets, or worse, you will be stuck paying your own expensive legal fees. You cannot just divorce a man with a clean record and deep corporate pockets, Brenda. You have to completely break his legs first. I sat frozen in my kitchen chair, listening to the sinister calculation in his voice. Brenda asked him what she was supposed to do. She sounded almost panicked that her flawless plan might actually have a fatal hole in it. Mitch did not hesitate for a single second. He had clearly been plotting this exact scenario in his dark mind for a very long time. "You have to get him fired, Brenda," Mitch instructed, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. "But not just fired for poor performance. You have to get him terminated for cause with a massive cloud of criminal suspicion hanging over his head. If he loses that job, he loses his corporate legal counsel package immediately. He loses his remaining pension contributions. He loses his steady income stream, which means he literally cannot afford to fight you in court." I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. They were not just trying to rob me. They were actively conspiring to leave me utterly destitute and incapable of defending myself. Mitch laid out the exact strategy with terrifying precision. He told my wife she needed to bypass my direct supervisor and call the chief executive officer of the logistics firm directly. "You call his big boss," Mitch instructed, "and you play the terrified, battered wife routine. You tell his boss that Calvin has been secretly siphoning company freight funds for months. You tell them you found hidden financial ledgers in his home office while you were cleaning. You claim he is stealing corporate money to hide assets for a secret double life. You tell the boss you are absolutely terrified he is going to go to federal jail and drag the entire logistics company down with him. You demand they terminate his employment immediately before you are forced to blow the whistle and call the federal auditors yourself." The sheer, unadulterated malice of that conversation paralyzed my lungs. I could not pull a single breath of air into my chest. They did not just want to take my money and walk away. They wanted to obliterate my entire identity. They wanted to strip me of the one thing I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building, which was my immaculate professional reputation. For a 62-year-old black man in corporate America, a spotless reputation is not just a badge of honor, It is a vital shield. I had worked 35 years to prove I was the most reliable, honest, and hardworking man in any room I walked into. If a man in my position gets fired for corporate embezzlement at my age, his career is permanently and violently over. No one in the logistics industry would ever hire me again. My union benefits would vanish into thin air. My health insurance would evaporate overnight. A family court judge presiding over a divorce case would look at a disgraced, unemployed criminal suspect and happily hand the entire marital estate over to the poor, suffering wife who bravely exposed him. Brenda sounded hesitant at first. She asked Mitch if making a false accusation of embezzlement was dangerous. She worried the company might demand actual proof of the stolen ledgers. But Mitch quickly silenced her fears with his typical slimy confidence. "Corporate executives are cowards, Brenda." Mitch scoffed. "They despise public scandals, and they fear federal audits more than anything else in the world. If the chief executive officer thinks there is even a 1% chance Calvin is stealing freight money, he will fire him on the spot just to protect the company liability. They will not wait for an investigation. They will just cut the cord and throw him out on the street. By the time Calvin tries to prove his innocence, you will already have the divorce finalized and the house in your name. Do exactly what I am telling you to do. Call his boss on Thursday morning and set the fire." The audio recording clicked and the Bluetooth connection ended. The dash camera files shifted back to the simple, quiet, ambient noise of Brenda driving her luxury vehicle into our suburban driveway. I sat in the dark stillness of my kitchen, staring at the speaker grills of my laptop. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It felt incredibly dangerous. The grief that had been suffocating me for the past 24 hours was completely gone. The heartbreak of losing the woman I loved had evaporated. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. It was the absolute calmness of a man who realizes he is no longer fighting to save a broken marriage or a piece of real estate. I was fighting for my very survival. They wanted to bury me alive under a mountain of lies. They wanted to take a man who had never stolen a single dime in his life and brand him as a corporate thief. I slowly closed the laptop screen. Mitch and Brenda thought they were brilliant. They thought they had crafted the ultimate foolproof plan to destroy me. They assumed I was just a tired old warehouse manager who would roll over and accept defeat when the pressure became too great. They thought because I loved her, I was inherently weak, but they made a catastrophic miscalculation. They did not realize that a man who has managed chaotic logistics, supply chains for 3.5 decades, knows exactly how to handle a hostile threat. You do not panic when the enemy reveals their strategy. You adapt. You wait for them to make their move, and you build a trap so devastating they never see the walls closing in until it is far too late to escape. So I picked up my empty coffee mug and walked over to the sink. The sun was fully rising now, casting a bright, harsh light across the kitchen floor. My hands were no longer shaking. My mind was completely clear. If Brenda wanted to call my boss and accuse me of federal crimes, I was not going to try and stop her. I was going to let her make that phone call. I was going to let her walk right into the office and tell her vicious lies, because a trap only works when the prey walks into it willingly. And I was going to make absolutely certain the jaws of this trap snapped shut on Friday afternoon. The morning shift began with a punishing blast of Arctic air that swept straight through the loading bays of our Atlanta logistics hub. The raw concrete floor of the main distribution center felt like a solid sheet of ice beneath my heavy steel toe boots. We were dealing with a massive freight crisis that had started unraveling right around 3 in the morning. A disastrous multi-vehicle pileup on the northbound lanes of Interstate 75 had completely paralyzed the highway, trapping 4 of our largest refrigerated trailers. Those trucks were loaded to the brim with highly perishable medical supplies and specialized pharmaceutical inventory. If those specific units did not reach their destination hubs by noon, we were looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in spoiled goods. Even worse, it would cause a logistical nightmare that would completely wreck our quarterly performance metrics and damage our reputation with our most critical clients. This warehouse floor was my true element. This was the exact kind of high-stakes chaos where my 35 years of relentless grinding experience actually paid off. I stood at the elevated dispatch desk overlooking the sprawling operation, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and a two-way radio in the other. I was directing forklift operators, shouting over the mechanical roar of heavy machinery, rerouting alternate drivers through obscure county backroads, and negotiating firmly with angry regional vendors over the telephone line. I kept my voice perfectly steady, my instructions crystal clear, and my entire demeanor absolutely unshakable. Young men twice my size and half my age looked up to me for direction because they knew Calvin Hayes never panicked under pressure. I took a deep, profound pride in that fact. I had built my entire identity on being the unmovable rock in the middle of the storm. I was a black man who had started out sweeping these very floors, and I had earned every single promotion, every raise, and every ounce of respect through sheer grit. But while I was standing on that freezing concrete floor, fighting tooth and nail to save the company from a massive financial catastrophe, the woman I had devoted my entire life to was sitting in the comfort of the luxurious home I paid for actively dialing a phone number to orchestrate my total destruction. I would later learn the exact agonizing details of the performance she delivered that morning. Brenda had not bothered to call the Human Resources Department. She knew Human Resources would mandate a slow, methodical investigation involving union representatives and corporate mediators. That kind of slow, tedious process would give me plenty of time to defend myself. It would give me time to access my corporate legal benefits and uncover her lies. Following the sinister blueprint laid out by her debt collector brother Mitch, Brenda went straight to the very top of the food chain. She bypassed all the standard corporate protocols and demanded an urgent, highly confidential phone call with Harrison Cole, the chief executive officer of the entire logistics firm. Harrison was a notoriously ruthless businessman. He was a former military officer who ran his corporate empire with absolute precision and zero tolerance for nonsense. He did not entertain personal drama, and he rarely spoke directly with regional managers unless there was a catastrophic failure on the board. He was a man who dealt in numbers, liabilities, and risk management. Brenda knew this perfectly well. She sat at our custom granite kitchen island, drinking imported tea, and dialed the executive suite. When Harrison finally accepted the call, she unleashed a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She did not just sound upset. She sounded completely broken. She lowered her voice to a trembling, terrified whisper, deliberately making it sound as though she were hiding in a closet, fearing for her physical safety. She told the chief executive officer of my company that the Calvin Hayes he knew, the dedicated, hard-working logistics manager, was a complete and total fabrication. She spun a web of lies so intricate and so malicious that it still makes my blood run entirely cold just thinking about the sheer cruelty of it. She wept softly into the receiver, claiming that my behavior had become erratic, hostile, and deeply abusive over the past 6 months. But she knew personal marital issues would not be enough to get me terminated on the spot. Corporate executives do not involve themselves in messy divorces unless the bottom line is threatened. So she deployed the ultimate weapon her brother Mitch had handed her. She told Harrison Cole that she had discovered a set of hidden financial ledgers tucked away in a locked drawer in my home office. She claimed she had found undeniable proof that I had been systematically siphoning corporate freight funds for over a year. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a desperate, greedy man who was manipulating vendor invoices, skimming off the top of massive logistics contracts, and creating phantom delivery routes to fund a secret degenerate double life. She told him I was hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in offshore accounts, and that I had threatened to physically destroy her if she ever breathed a single word of it to anyone. Brenda knew exactly what buttons to push to trigger a massive corporate panic. She wept to Harrison, saying she could not live with the soul-crushing guilt of covering up a federal corporate crime. She played the role of the brave, battered wife stepping forward to do the right thing despite the immense mortal danger to her own life. And then she delivered the absolute fatal blow to my career. She told Harrison that she had already retained a lawyer and was preparing to contact the federal auditors by the end of the week. She issued a direct, terrifying ultimatum to the man who signed my paychecks. She demanded that the company terminate my employment immediately before the end of the day. She warned him that if they allowed a thief to remain on the payroll and the federal auditors uncovered the missing freight money, the entire logistics firm would be subjected to a devastating public scandal. She made it crystal clear that if they simply fired me and cut me loose, she would keep the company name out of the press and handle the rest through local authorities. But if they hesitated for even 1 second, she would burn the entire corporation to the ground. It was a brilliantly evil strategy. Corporations are incredibly fragile entities when it comes to public relations and federal scrutiny. A massive logistics company handling millions of dollars in interstate commerce cannot afford even the slightest whisper of embezzlement or fraud. Mitch and Brenda were banking on the absolute fact that an executive like Harrison Cole would panic. They assumed he would look at the sheer radioactive liability I suddenly represented and cut my throat without a second thought. Why would a chief executive risk a federal audit to save one regional warehouse manager? The safest corporate move, the only logical move, would be to strip me of my title, revoke my access to the building, and cancel all my employee benefits before the sun went down. While Brenda was pouring lethal poison into the ears of the executive board, I was down on the warehouse floor, completely oblivious, securing a major victory. I had successfully managed to reroute 2 local independent drivers to intercept the stranded trailers on Interstate 75. We managed to cross-load the perishable medical goods onto fresh trucks right there on the icy shoulder of the highway, bypassing the massive traffic jam and saving the entire shipment. I keyed my radio and thanked the dock crew for their tremendous hustle. A few of the younger forklift drivers wiped the sweat from their foreheads and gave me a thumbs up and a tired, respectful smile. The crisis was officially averted. I took a long sip of my lukewarm coffee, feeling the familiar, satisfying ache in my shoulders that always followed a hard-won victory. I felt profoundly proud of my team. I felt like I had truly earned my keep for the day. That was exactly when I noticed the heavy steel door of the administrative stairwell swing open. Eleanor, the senior executive secretary, stepped out onto the dusty concrete floor. She looked completely out of place, standing there in her sharp, tailored suit, amidst the towering wooden pallets of cardboard boxes and the roaring diesel engines. She had worked for the company almost as long as I had. We had always shared a warm, professional relationship, often trading stories about our grandchildren by the break room coffee machine. But today, as she walked toward the elevated dispatch desk, her face was incredibly pale and tight. I set my coffee mug down, wiping a thick smear of engine grease from my hands with a shop rag. I expected her to ask me about the delayed shipments or to hand me an updated freight manifest for the afternoon block. Instead, she stopped at the bottom of the metal stairs leading up to my desk and looked up at me. She absolutely refused to meet my eyes. She stared fixedly at the rusted clipboard resting on my desk, her hands visibly trembling. "Calvin," she said, her voice unnaturally strained and quiet. "You need to come with me right now. Harrison wants to see you in his office immediately." The temperature in the massive warehouse seemed to drop another 20 degrees. I felt a sudden sharp prickle of cold sweat form on the back of my neck. Harrison Cole never summoned regional managers to the executive suite unannounced. If there was a logistical error, he handled it over the phone or sent an operations director down to the floor to chew us out. A direct, immediate summons to the top-floor glass office meant only one thing in corporate America. It was the long, silent walk to the professional guillotine. I looked down at Eleanor, trying to catch her gaze, but she kept her eyes glued to the concrete floor, shifting her weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. She knew something. The entire administrative floor probably knew something. Rumors spread like wildfire in a corporate office, and the sheer panic on her face told me this was not a routine performance review. "Is there a problem with the highway crossload?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level, projecting the calm, unshakable authority I was known for. "We just secured the perishables. The trucks are moving ahead of schedule." "It is not about the freight," Calvin Eleanor replied, her voice barely a frightened whisper. "Just please come with me." I slowly unclipped the heavy two-way radio from my leather belt and set it down on the dispatch desk. The heavy realization settled over me like a suffocating weighted blanket. The trap had been sprung. Brenda had made her move. I did not know exactly what lie she had told or what specific poison she had injected into the executive suite, but I knew the wheels of my destruction were officially in motion. They were going to strip me of everything. 35 years of spotless service, 35 years of waking up in the dark and breaking my back for this company were about to be erased by a single malicious phone call from a woman I had loved more than my own life. I nodded to my shift supervisor, signaling for him to take over the dispatch board. I walked down the metal stairs, my heavy steel toe boots clanking loudly against the grating. I followed Eleanor across the massive warehouse floor. Every single step felt like walking through deep, freezing mud. The familiar sounds of the distribution center, the beeping of reversing forklifts, the hydraulic hiss of the loading docks, the rough laughter of the hard-working dock workers suddenly felt incredibly distant and muted. I was walking through the very kingdom I had helped build, knowing I was about to be permanently exiled from it. We entered the administrative stairwell, leaving the strong smell of diesel and cardboard dust behind. As we rode the silent carpeted elevator up to the top executive floor, I stared straight ahead at the polished metal doors. My mind was an absolute fortress of focus. I could feel the bitter grief and the burning anger trying to claw their way up my throat, trying to make my hands shake, but I pushed them down with brutal, unyielding force. A black man of my generation, working his way up the corporate ladder, learns very early on that you are never allowed to lose your composure. You are never allowed to show them that you are bleeding. If they were going to execute my career today, they were going to have to look me in the eye while I stood tall. The elevator doors slid open with a soft electronic chime, revealing the pristine, quiet luxury of the executive suite. The thick, plush carpet absorbed the heavy thud of my work boots. We walked past a long row of silent administrative cubicles. Nobody looked at me. The few executives sitting at their desks suddenly found their computer screens incredibly fascinating. The air was thick with the toxic, humiliating scent of impending corporate doom. Eleanor stopped in front of the massive frosted glass doors that led to the chief executive officer's private office. She did not open the door for me. She simply gave a quick, jerky nod, stepped back, and hurried away toward the break room, completely abandoning me in the hallway. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs completely. I reached out, turned the heavy cold brass handle, and pushed the glass door open. The office was enormous, dominated by a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Atlanta highway system. Harrison Cole sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, his large hands clasped tightly together, resting on top of a single manila folder. He was a formidable, intimidating man, with sharp silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and a rigid jawline that looked like it had been carved out of solid granite. He was wearing a dark, immaculate tailored suit that made my faded, grease-stained work shirt look utterly pathetic in comparison. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. Harrison did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask me how the morning freight crisis was going. He did not offer his hand for a shake. He simply sat there staring at me with a dead, serious, unblinking expression. His eyes were cold, analytical, and completely devoid of any warmth or basic professional courtesy. He was looking at me not as a trusted veteran manager, but as a severe, dangerous corporate liability that needed to be surgically removed. I closed the heavy glass door behind me, the soft mechanical click echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. I stood at attention, keeping my shoulders squared and my chin elevated. I was not going to cower. I was not going to beg. Calvin Harrison said, his voice remarkably low and rough, carrying the heavy, crushing weight of a judge about to hand down a terminal sentence. "Yes, sir," I replied, my tone perfectly steady and respectful. Harrison unclasped his large hands and gestured toward the single leather chair positioned directly in front of his massive mahogany desk. "Sit down, Calvin," he commanded, pointing a rigid finger, "and close those blinds before you do. We are going to need complete, absolute privacy for this conversation." I turned around, reaching for the heavy mechanical wand that controlled the privacy blinds on the glass walls. As I twisted the wand, the thick gray slats slowly rotated, shutting out the view of the administrative floor and plunging the executive office into a tense, isolated dimness. The physical act of closing those blinds felt incredibly final. It felt like drawing the permanent curtain on 35 years of my life. I walked over and sat down in the leather chair, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my hands resting firmly on my knees. I looked directly into the cold, unforgiving eyes of my chief executive officer, bracing my entire soul for the devastating blow that was about to end my career, my legal protection, and my ability to fight the woman who was actively trying to bury me alive. The heavy mahogany desk stretched out like a massive wooden battlefield between us. I sat there completely rigid, with my hands resting firmly on my kneecaps, bracing my entire soul for the absolute worst moment of my professional life. Harrison Cole leaned back in his high leather executive chair, steepling his fingers under his sharp chin. The silence in that room was thick enough to choke on. I had spent 35 years building a spotless record, hauling freight, working graveyard shifts, and managing thousands of men. Now it was all hanging by a single frayed thread over a dark pit of lies woven by the woman I had married. I looked at the man who held my entire future in his hands, waiting for the corporate executioner to finally drop the axe. Harrison did not reach for a termination form. He did not press the intercom button to call in human resources to escort me out of the building. Instead, he let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a dry wind rustling through dead leaves. He looked at me with those piercing blue eyes, assessing me from head to toe. He was a veteran, a man who had seen actual combat before entering the corporate world, and he possessed an uncanny ability to read a person's character. "Calvin," he began, his voice rumbling low and steady in the dim office. "We have known each other for over a decade. I have watched you run the most difficult warehouse floor in this entire southern region without a single complaint. You are a man who commands respect because you give respect. You have never missed a target, you have never falsified a report, and you have never once asked for a handout. So you can imagine my absolute surprise when my private office line rang this morning, And I found myself listening to a woman claiming to be your terrified wife telling me that you are a common thief. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what Brenda had done, but hearing it spoken aloud in the executive suite made the betrayal feel incredibly raw and dangerous. She told me quite a story, Calvin Harrison continued, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the desk. She wept. She trembled. She pleaded for my help. She told me you have been siphoning corporate freight funds for over a year, hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret offshore accounts. She demanded that I terminate your employment immediately to protect the company. She threatened to call the federal auditors by the end of the week if I did not throw you out on the street today. She painted a very convincing picture of a desperate, dangerous man who was destroying his family to fund a secret life. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to defend myself. I knew that in corporate America, the moment you start desperately pleading your innocence is the moment they assume you are guilty. I simply looked at him, waiting for the final blow. But Harrison Cole did not look angry. He looked profoundly disgusted. He slowly shook his head side to side, a cold, hard smile touching the corners of his mouth. Your wife put on a truly magnificent performance, Calvin, he said, his tone turning sharp and icy. She practically deserves an Academy Award for the amount of fake distress she managed to push through the telephone receiver. But I did not serve in the military and build a billion-dollar logistics empire by blindly trusting hysterical phone calls. I run internal audits every single quarter. I know exactly where every single dime in this company goes. I know for a fact that your region has the lowest discrepancy rate in the entire national network. I know you are not stealing from me. The heavy, crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for the past 4 days suddenly cracked. I felt a microscopic sliver of oxygen enter my lungs. I maintained my stoic expression, but my hands grasped my knees just a little bit tighter. Your wife thinks I am a complete fool, Harrison stated, his voice echoing with a dangerous metallic edge. She thinks she can use my company as a weapon to destroy a good man in the middle of a divorce. She thinks she can terrorize my executive suite to force my hand. Your wife thinks I am a fool, Calvin. But her boyfriend is an even bigger one. My eyes widened slightly. I had not mentioned Derek to anyone at the company. I had not even spoken his name out loud since I discovered the hidden dashcam audio in my garage. How could the chief executive officer of my logistics firm possibly know about my wife's young, arrogant real estate broker lover? Harrison reached out and gripped the edge of his sleek silver laptop monitor. He turned the screen around so it was facing me directly. He tapped a few keys, bringing up a complex audio playback software interface. Let me explain something about corporate telecommunications, Calvin Harrison said, folding his hands together. My private executive extension is an unlisted internal number. You cannot find it in a phone book. You cannot find it on our website. The only people who possess this direct line are regional managers, corporate vice presidents, and a few select family members. Your wife obviously had the number saved in her phone for emergency situations. But our corporate servers do not just handle incoming calls. They log, route, and record every single piece of data that touches the executive exchange. He leaned back and pointed at the computer screen. Last night, around 2 a.m, our server registered a strange incoming call on my direct line. It went straight to my executive voicemail. Our security team pulled the file this morning, just an hour before your wife decided to call me with her little extortion scheme. It appears that a very drunk, very arrogant young man tried to call your wife's unlisted private line. But instead of dialing her number, he accidentally dialed the corporate executive number she had recently viewed on her phone screen. He misdialed Calvin. He thought he was leaving a private romantic message for Brenda. A cold electric shock bolted straight down my spine. The sheer monumental stupidity of Derek Mitchell was about to be laid bare in the highest office of my company. "Listen closely," Harrison instructed, pressing the play button on his keyboard. The audio file began with the muffled sound of loud, heavy bass music and the clinking of cocktail glasses. It sounded like a crowded, expensive nightclub or a high-end hotel bar. And then the voice came through the laptop speakers. It was slurred, heavily intoxicated, but completely and undeniably recognizable. It was Derek. "Hey, baby," the voice crowed, dripping with an unbearable, sloppy arrogance. "Just sitting here celebrating at the lounge. I know you said you were turning your phone off for the weekend to deal with the old man, but I just had to call and hear your voice. I am looking at the business account right now. You are an absolute genius, Brenda. The entire $91,000 from your old man's corporate account cleared perfectly. We are rich, baby. He is completely wiped out, and he does not even have a clue. Enjoy your night. I will see you when you get back." The recording ended with a sharp click, leaving the dim office in a ringing, deafening silence. I sat staring at the black screen, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of the catastrophic error Derek had just committed. He was drunk. He was celebrating my financial ruin. He had meant to call Brenda to gloat about the stolen money. But in his arrogant, intoxicated haze, he had somehow pulled the wrong number from her recent contact list and dropped his entire confession directly into the voicemail box of the most powerful and ruthless man in my professional life. But there was one specific phrase in that audio clip that echoed in my head. One specific choice of words that made my blood run entirely cold. "Did you catch it?" Calvin Harrison asked, his eyes narrowing into deadly predatory slits. "Did you hear exactly what that idiot said on the recording?" I nodded slowly, my throat dry. "He said the money came from my corporate account." "Exactly," Harrison replied, leaning forward and slamming his hand flat against the mahogany desk. "He did not say personal account. He did not say retirement fund. In his drunken bragging, he specifically referenced a corporate account. He explicitly stated that he and your wife successfully extracted $91,000 from a corporate entity." I looked at Harrison, trying to grasp the full legal weight of what he was telling me. "I wired that money from my personal savings, sir," I explained carefully. "It had nothing to do with the company finances. It was my own private money." Harrison waved his hand dismissively, cutting me off. "It does not matter where the money actually came from, Calvin. What matters is what they stated on a recorded federal telecommunications line. That boy called an executive corporate server and proudly confessed to securing unauthorized funds from a corporate account. And then just a few hours later, your wife called me and threatened to unleash federal auditors on my company if I did not terminate your employment." Harrison stood up from his leather chair, walking around the massive desk. He paced slowly in front of the closed privacy blinds, looking like a caged tiger preparing to strike. "If this were just a messy suburban divorce, Calvin, I would offer you my personal sympathies and suggest you hire a good family lawyer, but it is no longer just a messy divorce. When your wife colluded with her brother to call my office and threaten my company with federal auditors, she crossed a massive legal boundary. That is textbook corporate extortion. And when her idiot boyfriend called our internal server across state lines, because our servers are securely housed in Virginia, and confessed to receiving stolen corporate funds that elevated this entire situation to attempted federal wire fraud, my heart hammered against my ribs. I had known Brenda and Derek were vicious, but I had no idea they had accidentally stumbled into a federal crime. In their desperate, greedy rush to break my spirit and steal my house, they had blindly triggered the security protocols of a billion-dollar corporate entity. "Your wife thought she was isolating you," Harrison said, stopping in front of my chair and looking down at me. "She thought by attacking your job, she was removing your armor. She assumed I would fire you to protect myself, leaving you entirely defenseless. She made the fatal assumption that a corporation has no loyalty to its people. But I protect my commanders, Calvin. You have held the line for this company for 35 years. You have bled for this company. I am not going to let a greedy amateur real estate broker and a manipulative woman destroy one of my best men. Before I could even process the profound wave of gratitude and relief washing over me, the heavy glass door of the office swung open. 3 individuals walked into the dim room, moving with the synchronized predatory grace of a hungry wolf pack. I recognized the man leading the group immediately. It was Marcus Vance, the general counsel and head of the corporate legal department. He was flanked by 2 sharply dressed associate attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases. These were not local family court lawyers who argued over alimony and shared custody. These were ruthless, high-powered corporate litigators. These were the men who destroyed rival companies, defended against federal lawsuits, and absolutely obliterated anyone who threatened the firm. Marcus adjusted his glasses and gave me a brief, completely unsmiling nod. He walked over to the mahogany desk and set his briefcase down, popping the brass latches with a sharp, metallic snap. "We have reviewed the dashcam audio files you uploaded to the secure server this morning," Calvin Marcus said, his voice crisp and devoid of any emotion. "We have also analyzed the extortion threats your wife made to Mr. Cole and the voicemail left by Derek Mitchell." I looked at Harrison, completely stunned. "You brought the corporate legal team into this." Harrison placed a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. "You are an asset to this company, Calvin. An attack on you using our infrastructure and threatening our reputation is an attack on us. Your wife and her accomplices have engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to extort a corporate officer and commit wire fraud. We are not just going to help you protect your house. We are going to bring the entire catastrophic weight of this corporation down on their heads." Marcus pulled a thick stack of pristine white legal documents from his briefcase and spread them across the desk. He adjusted his tie, looking at me with the cold calculation of a man preparing for total war. "Here is exactly how we are going to proceed, Calvin," the general counsel stated, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. "We have already drafted a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Derek Mitchell and his new commercial brokerage firm. We are freezing his business assets pending a federal investigation into his claim of receiving stolen corporate funds. He will not be able to spend a single dime of that $91,000. His business is officially dead before it even opens its doors." One of the associate attorneys stepped forward, handing me a separate set of documents. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "we have drafted an injunction against your brother-in-law, Mitch. His little debt collection business is going to be audited by our corporate investigators for attempting to orchestrate corporate extortion. We will bury him in so much aggressive litigation, he will spend the next 10 years trying to avoid bankruptcy." I sat in the leather chair, staring at the absolute mountain of legal firepower laid out before me. Just an hour ago, I had walked into this office believing my life was entirely over. I thought Brenda had successfully severed my lifeline and left me to drown. Instead, her malicious greed had backfired with apocalyptic consequences. She had tried to sick a monster on me, but the monster had turned around and was now actively preparing to devour her. "And as for your wife," Marcus added, his voice dropping an octave, "she plans to walk onto your warehouse floor tomorrow afternoon to publicly humiliate you with divorce papers. She wants an audience. She wants a spectacle to break your pride." Harrison squeezed my shoulder, his grip tightening with a fierce, absolute loyalty. "We are going to give her exactly the spectacle she wants, Calvin. But when she walks through those loading bay doors tomorrow, she is not going to find a broken, defeated man. She is going to walk straight into a corporate ambush." I looked down at the polished mahogany desk, feeling the last lingering shadows of grief completely vanish from my heart. I was no longer the heartbroken husband, mourning the loss of a 20-year marriage. I was no longer the terrified victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was an angry man armed with the most destructive corporate legal machine in the state. I picked up the silver pen from the desk, ready to sign my name to the documents. I was ready to go to war. Sitting in that immaculate executive office surrounded by corporate sharks, I watched my entire reality completely shift. Harrison Cole, the man I thought was about to end my 35-year career, leaned over his polished mahogany desk and pressed the speakerphone button on his digital console. We were not just planning a legal defense. We were meticulously building a trap so deep and so perfectly camouflaged that my wife would never see the bottom until she was already falling. The corporate lawyers flanked me like statues, their faces hard and unreadable, waiting for the chief executive officer to make his move. Harrison dialed Brenda's cell phone number. The dial tone echoed loudly in the massive glass office. I held my breath, gripping the armrests of my leather chair. It was time for the boss of the entire logistics firm to play his part. When Brenda finally answered the line, her voice was thick with that fake, syrupy concern she had practiced so flawlessly. Harrison did not miss a single beat. He deployed an Oscar-worthy performance. He sounded incredibly furious. He sounded exactly like a billionaire who had just discovered a massive rat infesting his financial vault. He told her he had reviewed the preliminary corporate numbers and was absolutely horrified by the staggering extent of my supposed embezzlement. He told her she was a remarkably brave woman for coming forward and saving his company from a catastrophic federal disaster. I sat there listening to the woman I had married soak up his praise like a dry sponge. She played the terrified, battered victim, telling Harrison she was just so deeply worried about my declining mental state and the physical safety of her family. She told him I was acting completely unhinged at home, pacing the floors and guarding my home office like a wild animal. The sheer magnitude of her lies was breathtaking. She was painting me as a volatile criminal who was on the verge of taking the entire company down in flames. Harrison let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, perfectly matching her fabricated energy. He told her he was pulling the trigger on Friday afternoon. He explicitly stated he was going to strip me of my regional manager title, terminate my pension contributions, and throw me out of the building with nothing but the clothes on my back. But then he added the brilliant twist that the legal team had devised. He told Brenda that because she was the key corporate whistleblower, the internal legal department needed her to sign a set of highly confidential witness affidavits right there on company property. He insisted she had to sign them just moments before they brought me into the office for the final termination. He told her to come directly to the main logistics warehouse at 3:00 on Friday afternoon. He promised her she would be completely safe in the elevated executive conference room overlooking the floor while they handled the dirty work of destroying my life. Brenda eagerly, enthusiastically agreed. She thought she was being invited to watch my public execution from the absolute best seat in the house. She had zero idea that the paperwork waiting for her on that mahogany table was not a witness affidavit, but a devastating corporate lawsuit and federal evidence logs tying her to wire fraud and extortion. I left that office feeling a strange, heavy calm settling over my bones. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood felt like moving through an entirely different dimension. For 20 years, I had pulled my truck into that concrete driveway, thinking of my brick house as a sacred sanctuary. Now it was nothing more than a hostile stage, and I had to deliver the most convincing performance of my entire life. I parked my truck, walked through the heavy wooden front door, and immediately let my broad shoulders visibly slump. I allowed the natural crushing exhaustion of the past few days to settle deep into the lines of my aging face. I had to completely become the broken, defeated man she desperately wanted to see. When I walked into the kitchen, Brenda was leaning against the cool granite island, typing furiously on her cell phone. She looked up at me and quickly locked the illuminated screen, setting the device face down. I dragged my heavy steel toe boots across the floor, letting out a long, weary sigh that seemed to rattle in my chest. I poured myself a mug of black coffee and sat down heavily at the oak dining table, staring blankly at the wood grain. I did not say a single word. I just let my calloused hands tremble slightly around the warm ceramic mug. Brenda watched me with the sharp, calculating eyes of a starving hawk. She walked over and asked me how work was using that fake, gentle tone that now made my stomach physically churn. I mumbled something vague about unexpected audits and missing warehouse inventory, letting my voice intentionally crack just a fraction. I told her the corporate pressure at the distribution center was getting to be way too much, and I felt like the walls were actively closing in on me. I rubbed my temples, pretending to fight off a massive impending migraine. The absolute pure joy that flashed across her face was chilling to witness. She masked it quickly under a look of deep wifely concern, but I saw it clearly. I saw the triumphant, greedy gleam in her dark eyes. She walked over and placed a soft hand on my shoulder gently, telling me that everything was going to be all right, and that maybe I just needed to take some permanent time off to rest my body. She was actively relishing my supposed mental and professional collapse. She was tasting the blood in the water. For the next 3 days, I played the part of the dying man to absolute perfection. I completely stopped eating dinner, claiming my stomach was tied in knots. I paced to the dark hallways late at night, dragging my feet and sighing into the quiet shadows. I sat in my worn leather recliner for hours, staring at the blank television screen, like a man waiting for the end of the world. I became a ghost, haunting my own living room, projecting the image of a cornered animal who knew the corporate hunters were circling the perimeter. And while I played the tragic victim, Brenda strutted around the house like a conquering queen who had just claimed a massive new territory. She was absolutely glowing with arrogant invincibility. She spent countless hours in the upstairs spare bedroom, talking in hushed, giddy tones on her cell phone. I knew she was talking to Derek, her young, sleazy real estate broker, and her manipulative debt collector, brother Mitch. They were undoubtedly celebrating the money they had successfully stolen and excitedly counting down the hours until Friday afternoon. The psychological warfare in that house was absolutely suffocating. She started carelessly leaving glossy real estate brochures for luxury downtown condominiums right on the kitchen counter. She was already shopping for her brand new life with Derek, using the massive seed money she had extorted from my crushed bones. She would hum a happy little tune while making her morning tea, completely unbothered by the miserable, broken husband sitting just a few feet away. The sheer audacity of her greed was staggering to witness, but it only continuously fueled the cold, calculated fire burning deep inside my chest. Every time she smiled at her phone, I added another layer of steel to my resolve. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house had reached a boiling, dangerous crescendo. It was the night before the corporate trap was scheduled to snap shut. I was sitting in the dark living room, nursing a cold cup of coffee and pretending to review meaningless warehouse logs on my laptop. Brenda walked down the carpeted stairs, carrying a sleek, black garment bag. She laid it carefully over the back of the floral sofa, unzipping the plastic cover to reveal a sharp, expensive designer suit. It was a tailored crimson-red jacket with matching slacks and a crisp white silk blouse. It was the kind of power outfit a woman wears when she wants to make an unforgettable, dominant entrance. She was meticulously preparing her armor for the warehouse. She was getting ready to walk onto my logistics floor, humiliate me in front of the hard-working men I had trained for decades, and serve me with aggressive divorce papers, while my boss supposedly fired me for corporate theft. She wanted to look absolutely flawless while she burned my legacy to the ground. I watched her smooth out the rich fabric of the crimson jacket, her manicured fingers brushing away invisible pieces of lint. She looked over at me, sitting quietly in the shadows, and gave me a soft, highly condescending smile. She told me I looked terrible and advised me to get some deep rest because tomorrow was going to be a very big, important day for my career. The sheer venom hidden beneath her sweet, polite words was enough to stop a man's heart. I looked right back at her, keeping my facial expression perfectly hollow and appropriately broken. I nodded slowly, letting my gaze drop back to the floor. I told her she was absolutely right. I told her tomorrow was going to change everything for us. She seemed entirely satisfied with my pathetic response. She turned away and walked back up the stairs, the soft, rhythmic sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet, empty house. I sat completely alone in the dark, listening to the low mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator. The crippling grief that had haunted me earlier in the week was completely gone. The agonizing heartbreak of losing my wife was entirely dead and buried. I was no longer a victim. I was a veteran regional manager, and my warehouse was fully prepped and ready for the arrival of the enemy. Friday was coming, and the absolute reckoning was going to be biblical. Sitting in that immaculate executive office surrounded by corporate sharks, I watched my entire reality completely shift. Harrison Cole. The man I thought was about to end my 35-year career leaned over his polished mahogany desk and pressed the speakerphone button on his digital console. We were not just planning a legal defense. We were meticulously building a trap so deep and so perfectly camouflaged that my wife would never see the bottom until she was already falling. The corporate lawyers flanked me like statues, their faces hard and unreadable, waiting for the chief executive officer to make his move. Harrison dialed Brenda's cell phone number. The dial tone echoed loudly in the massive glass office. I held my breath, gripping the armrests of my leather chair. It was time for the boss of the entire logistics firm to play his part. When Brenda finally answered the line, her voice was thick with that fake, syrupy concern she had practiced so flawlessly. Harrison did not miss a single beat. He deployed an Oscar-worthy performance. He sounded incredibly furious. He sounded exactly like a billionaire who had just discovered a massive rat infesting his financial vault. He told her he had reviewed the preliminary corporate numbers and was absolutely horrified by the staggering extent of my supposed embezzlement. He told her she was a remarkably brave woman for coming forward and saving his company from a catastrophic federal disaster. I sat there listening to the woman I had married soak up his praise like a dry sponge. She played the terrified, battered victim, telling Harrison she was just so deeply worried about my declining mental state and the physical safety of her family. She told him I was acting completely unhinged at home, pacing the floors and guarding my home office like a wild animal. The sheer magnitude of her lies was breathtaking. She was painting me as a volatile criminal who was on the verge of taking the entire company down in flames. Harrison let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, perfectly matching her fabricated energy. He told her he was pulling the trigger on Friday afternoon. He explicitly stated he was going to strip me of my regional manager title, terminate my pension contributions, and throw me out of the building with nothing but the clothes on my back. But then he added the brilliant twist that the legal team had devised. He told Brenda that because she was the key corporate whistleblower, the internal legal department needed her to sign a set of highly confidential witness affidavits right there on company property. He insisted she had to sign them just moments before they brought me into the office for the final termination. He told her to come directly to the main logistics warehouse at 3:00 on Friday afternoon. He promised her she would be completely safe in the elevated executive conference room, overlooking the floor, while they handled the dirty work of destroying my life. Brenda eagerly, enthusiastically agreed. She thought she was being invited to watch my public execution from the absolute best seat in the house. She had zero idea that the paperwork waiting for her on that mahogany table was not a witness affidavit, but a devastating corporate lawsuit and federal evidence logs tying her to wire fraud and extortion. I left that office feeling a strange, heavy calm settling over my bones. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood felt like moving through an entirely different dimension. For 20 years, I had pulled my truck into that concrete driveway, thinking of my brick house as a sacred sanctuary. Now it was nothing more than a hostile stage, and I had to deliver the most convincing performance of my entire life. I parked my truck, walked through the heavy wooden front door, and immediately let my broad shoulders visibly slump. I allowed the natural, crushing exhaustion of the past few days to settle deep into the lines of my aging face. I had to completely become the broken, defeated man she desperately wanted to see. When I walked into the kitchen, Brenda was leaning against the cool granite island, typing furiously on her cell phone. She looked up at me and quickly locked the illuminated screen, setting the device face down. I dragged my heavy steel toe boots across the floor, letting out a long, weary sigh that seemed to rattle in my chest. I poured myself a mug of black coffee and sat down heavily at the oak dining table, staring blankly at the wood grain. I did not say a single word. I just let my calloused hands tremble slightly around the warm ceramic mug. Brenda watched me with the sharp, calculating eyes of a starving hawk. She walked over and asked me how work was using that fake, gentle tone that now made my stomach physically churn. I mumbled something vague about unexpected audits and missing warehouse inventory, letting my voice intentionally crack just a fraction. I told her the corporate pressure at the distribution center was getting to be way too much, and I felt like the walls were actively closing in on me. I rubbed my temples, pretending to fight off a massive impending migraine. The absolute pure joy that flashed across her face was chilling to witness. She masked it quickly under a look of deep wifely concern, but I saw it clearly. I saw the triumphant, greedy gleam in her dark eyes. She walked over and placed a soft hand on my shoulder, gently telling me that everything was going to be all right, and that maybe I just needed to take some permanent time off to rest my body. She was actively relishing my supposed mental and professional collapse. She was tasting the blood in the water. For the next 3 days, I played the part of the dying man to absolute perfection. I completely stopped eating dinner, claiming my stomach was tied in knots. I paced the dark hallways late at night, dragging my feet and sighing into the quiet shadows. I sat in my worn leather recliner for hours, staring at the blank television screen like a man waiting for the end of the world. I became a ghost, haunting my own living room, projecting the image of a cornered animal who knew the corporate hunters were circling the perimeter. And while I played the tragic victim, Brenda strutted around the house like a conquering queen who had just claimed a massive new territory. She was absolutely glowing with arrogant invincibility. She spent countless hours in the upstairs spare bedroom, talking in hushed, giddy tones on her cell phone. I knew she was talking to Derek, her young sleazy real estate broker, and her manipulative debt collector brother Mitch. They were undoubtedly celebrating the money they had successfully stolen and excitedly counting down the hours until Friday afternoon. The psychological warfare in that house was absolutely suffocating. She started carelessly leaving glossy real estate brochures for luxury downtown condominiums right on the kitchen counter. She was already shopping for her brand new life with Derek, using the massive seed money she had extorted from my crushed bones. She would hum a happy little tune while making her morning tea, completely unbothered by the miserable, broken husband sitting just a few feet away. The sheer audacity of her greed was staggering to witness, but it only continuously fueled the cold, calculated fire burning deep inside my chest. Every time she smiled at her phone, I added another layer of steel to my resolve. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house had reached a boiling, dangerous crescendo. It was the night before the corporate trap was scheduled to snap shut. I was sitting in the dark living room nursing a cold cup of coffee and pretending to review meaningless warehouse logs on my laptop. Brenda walked down the carpeted stairs carrying a sleek black garment bag. She laid it carefully over the back of the floral sofa, unzipping the plastic cover to reveal a sharp, expensive designer suit. It was a tailored crimson-red jacket with matching slacks and a crisp white silk blouse. It was the kind of power outfit a woman wears when she wants to make an unforgettable, dominant entrance. She was meticulously preparing her armor for the warehouse. She was getting ready to walk onto my logistics floor, humiliate me in front of the hard-working men I had trained for decades, and serve me with aggressive divorce papers while my boss supposedly fired me for corporate theft. She wanted to look absolutely flawless while she burned my legacy to the ground. I watched her smooth out the rich fabric of the crimson jacket, her manicured fingers brushing away invisible pieces of lint. She looked over at me, sitting quietly in the shadows, and gave me a soft, highly condescending smile. She told me I looked terrible and advised me to get some deep rest, because tomorrow was going to be a very big, important day for my career. The sheer venom hidden beneath her sweet, polite words was enough to stop a man's heart. I looked right back at her, keeping my facial expression perfectly hollow and appropriately broken. I nodded slowly, letting my gaze drop back to the floor. I told her she was absolutely right. I told her tomorrow was going to change everything for us. She seemed entirely satisfied with my pathetic response. She turned away and walked back up the stairs, the soft, rhythmic sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet, empty house. I sat completely alone in the dark, listening to the low mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator. The crippling grief that had haunted me earlier in the week was completely gone. The agonizing heartbreak of losing my wife was entirely dead and buried. I was no longer a victim. I was a veteran regional manager, and my warehouse was fully prepped and ready for the arrival of the enemy. Friday was coming, and the absolute reckoning was going to be biblical. Friday afternoon at the main Atlanta distribution center is never a quiet or peaceful affair. It is the absolute peak of the logistical week. The massive concrete floor becomes a living, breathing machine of rapidly moving parts and heavy industrial equipment. The air inside the building is always thick with the heavy scent of diesel fuel, dry cardboard dust, and the honest sweat of 200 hard-working men trying to finish their quotas before the weekend arrives. Forklifts zip down the wide designated aisles with their warning beacons flashing bright amber against the dull gray concrete walls. The hydraulic lifts on the dozen loading docks hiss and groan under immense weight as massive 18-wheeler trailers are filled to the absolute brim with outgoing commercial freight. It is a loud, chaotic symphony of blue-collar labor, and for 35 long years, it has been the very soundtrack of my existence. I was standing exactly where I always stood, at my elevated metal dispatch desk, overlooking the entire sprawling operation. My heavy, calloused hands were resting flat against the scarred metal surface of the workstation. I was not directing the floor traffic today. I was not shouting necessary orders into my two-way radio or coordinating complex delivery routes with the regional fleet managers. I was simply watching the massive bay doors and waiting. My mind was completely clear and entirely focused. The heavy, suffocating grief that had plagued me earlier in the week was completely gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I was a man standing in the absolute center of a battlefield, perfectly aware that the enemy was about to confidently breach the front gates. Right around 3:00 in the afternoon, the heavy industrial steel doors at the front of the facility swung wide open. The bright afternoon sunlight poured directly into the dim warehouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusted concrete floor. The usual frantic rhythm of the loading bays began to noticeably slow down. One by one, the veteran forklift drivers took their heavy boots off the accelerators, letting their machines idle. The men who were actively stacking heavy wooden pallets paused in their labor, wiping their brows with grease-stained rags. When you spend decades working in a closed industrial blue-collar environment, you instantly recognize when something fundamentally does not belong. The entire warehouse floor seemed to hold its collective breath as three sharply dressed figures stepped over the yellow safety caution lines and walked right into my working sanctuary. Leading the pack was Brenda. She was wearing the tailored crimson-red designer suit I had silently watched her carefully prepare the night before. Her dark hair was flawlessly styled, and her posture was completely rigid with an aggressive manufactured confidence. She walked with the exaggerated heavy steps of a woman who fully believed she owned the very ground she was walking on. The sharp clicking sound of her expensive high heels echoed faintly over the low rumble of the idling engines. To her left was Derek Mitchell. The young, arrogant commercial real estate broker was wearing a sharp navy blue tailored suit and his signature expensive leather loafers without any socks. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase tightly in his left hand, trying his absolute best to project the intimidating image of a high-powered corporate legal counsel. He kept his chin raised, looking around the dirty warehouse with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. To her right was Mitch. Brenda's sleazy debt collector brother wore a cheap, oversized gray suit that hung awkwardly off his lanky frame. He reeked of cheap cologne that battled with the smell of the warehouse exhaust. His face was plastered with a sick, predatory grin, taking immense visible pleasure in the fact that he was finally going to watch the man he had secretly hated for 20 years fall from grace. They looked entirely absurd walking through an active commercial freight terminal. They were three overly dressed intruders parading arrogantly through a world built entirely on calluses, heavy lifting, and honest sweat. My warehouse crew did not know exactly what was happening, but they knew severe trouble when they saw it. I watched my shift supervisors cross their massive arms over their chests, staring incredibly hard at the approaching trio. A low, confused murmur rippled through the aisles as the working men stepped back, giving them a wide berth. Brenda did not care about the audience of confused dock workers. In fact, she was actively thriving on the attention. This was the exact public spectacle she had meticulously planned in the car with Derek. She desperately wanted an audience to witness my ultimate destruction. She wanted the proud, hard-working men who had respected and followed me for decades to see their boss stripped of his dignity and thrown out like garbage. She kept her chin pointed toward the high steel rafters, marching directly toward my elevated dispatch desk, with Derek and Mitch flanking her like personal bodyguards. I did not move a single muscle. I stood silently behind my metal desk, looking down at them from my elevated platform. I let them climb the metal stairs one by one. Every sharp clank of their expensive shoes against the metal grating sounded incredibly loud in the sudden tense quiet of the warehouse. The ambient background noise had dropped to a near whisper. The massive industrial ventilation fans humming in the high ceiling were the only consistent sound left in the building. Brenda reached the top of the metal stairs and stopped just a few feet away from my desk. Her dark eyes were completely alight with a wicked, triumphant fire. She looked at me fully expecting to see a broken, terrified man. She expected to see a disgraced regional manager who had just been brutally fired from his job and stripped of his corporate pension by the executive board. She thought she was staring at an absolute total failure. Derek stepped up right beside her, adjusting his silk tie and giving me a look of pure, smug superiority. He gripped the handle of his leather briefcase like it was a loaded weapon. Mitch stood slightly behind them, crossing his arms and leaning lazily against the yellow safety railing. Mitch let out a soft, mocking chuckle, clearly enjoying the twisted power dynamic they had meticulously constructed. "Well," Calvin Brenda said, her voice cutting through the thick warehouse air like a jagged blade, "I guess the big important regional manager is not looking so tough and in charge today." I kept my hands resting flat on the desk. I looked directly at her face, studying the woman I had shared 20 years of my life with. I searched her dark eyes for even a single ounce of hesitation or genuine regret. But there was absolutely nothing there. She was completely hollowed out by her own monumental greed. Brenda did not wait for me to speak. She raised her right hand and snapped her fingers sharply at Derek. Derek quickly opened his sleek leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents, and handed them to her with a sickening little bow. Brenda took the heavy stack of papers and slammed them down onto the metal surface of my desk with a violent, dramatic force. The loud, aggressive smack echoed off the high warehouse ceiling, ensuring that every single worker within a 100-foot radius was paying close attention. She took a deep breath, deliberately raising her voice so her vicious words would carry across the vast concrete floor. She wanted the absolute maximum level of public humiliation. She wanted to break my spirit so thoroughly that I would never be able to look these loyal men in the eye ever again. "Those are official divorce papers, Calvin," she announced, her voice ringing out crisp, clear, and dripping with venom. "I am officially done hiding the absolute truth from the world. I am done living a miserable lie and pretending you are some kind of honorable, reliable provider. You are an absolute fraud. You are a complete failure of a man, and I will not let you drag me down with your miserable sinking ship." I heard the low, shocked murmurs erupt from my crew standing near the loading bays. A few of the older truck drivers who had known me for 20 years shifted uncomfortably, clearly angered by the sheer blatant disrespect being displayed in my own building. But nobody intervened. They respected my authority enough to let me handle my own personal business. Brenda placed both of her hands flat on the desk, leaning forward to aggressively invade my personal space. Her red suit practically vibrated with her hostile energy. "Do you honestly think you could hide your filthy criminal secrets from me forever?" she demanded loudly, pushing the exact false narrative she had fed to my chief executive officer earlier that week. "Do you think I would just stay quiet while you steal money to fund your pathetic secret life? You are a common criminal, Calvin. You are a severe disgrace to this logistics company, and you are an absolute disgrace to our family." Mitch let out another loud, obnoxious laugh from his spot on the railing. "That is exactly right, Brenda." Mitch chimed in, his voice rough and incredibly antagonistic. "Tell the big boss man exactly what he really is. He is nothing but a cheap warehouse thug who finally got caught with his dirty hands deep in the corporate cookie jar." I slowly shifted my gaze from Brenda to Mitch, and then finally to Derek. Derek was standing perfectly straight, trying desperately to look intimidating. He nodded in firm agreement with Mitch, clearly enjoying his fabricated role as the heavy legal muscle. Derek cleared his throat loudly and stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at the stack of divorce papers. "Mr. Hayes, my client is offering you a very generous and peaceful way out of this catastrophic legal mess," Derek said, his tone oozing with artificial professional concern. "Given your current imminent termination from this facility and your impending federal legal troubles regarding missing corporate funds, my client is entirely willing to forego a messy, highly public trial. If you simply sign over the full legal equity of the marital home and walk away quietly, right now, she will not push for further punitive financial damages. You sign the house over to Brenda today, and she lets you walk out of here with whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left." Brenda smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that fully revealed the absolute darkest depths of her betrayal. "You hear that, Calvin?" she whispered, her voice dripping with pure malice. "That is the absolute best deal you are ever going to get in your life. You have no job anymore. You have no corporate pension. You have no fancy corporate lawyers to hide behind. Harrison Cole already told me he is kicking you to the curb this afternoon. You have absolutely nothing left to fight with. So you are going to take this pen, you are going to sign the deed to my house over to me right now, and you are going to get out of my sight." She picked up a heavy silver pen from my desk organizer and threw it directly at my chest. It bounced hard off my faded work shirt and clattered onto the metal grating beneath our feet. "Sign the papers," Calvin Brenda demanded, her voice echoing across the silent warehouse floor one last time. "Sign the house over to me right now while I take out the trash." The heavy silence that followed her vicious declaration was absolutely deafening. The entire massive distribution center was completely frozen in time. 200 tough blue-collar men stood perfectly motionless, waiting with bated breath to see exactly how their veteran manager was going to react to being publicly slaughtered by his own wife. I looked down at the thick divorce documents resting on my desk. I looked at the signature lines demanding I surrender my hard-earned home to a woman who had orchestrated a massive federal extortion plot just to fund her young lover's startup business venture. I looked at Derek standing there in his expensive tailored suit that was literally paid for by my own blood, sweat, and tears. I looked at Mitch, grinning like a rabid feral dog who thought he had finally cornered his prey. And finally, I looked right back at Brenda. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger or slam my fists down against the metal desk. The burning explosive fury inside my chest had concentrated into a single point of absolute Arctic focus. I slowly stood up from my tall dispatch chair. I deliberately unbuttoned the front of my faded heavy work jacket and adjusted the collar, moving with a slow, meticulous, mechanical grace. I smoothed my calloused hands down the front of my shirt, standing at my absolute full height and squaring my broad shoulders. I looked at the three of them standing on my platform with an unreadable mask of absolute pure calm. I was a man standing perfectly on the edge of total victory, looking at three arrogant fools who had blindly and willingly walked themselves right into a reinforced steel cage. I took one deep, slow breath, letting the cool industrial warehouse air fill my lungs completely. The heavy industrial dust of the warehouse danced in the bright shafts of afternoon sunlight, creating a hazy golden curtain around the elevated dispatch platform. I stood perfectly still behind my scarred metal desk, looking down at the three people who had conspired to erase my entire existence. Brenda was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling beneath her tailored crimson jacket. She was waiting for an explosion. She was waiting for the angry, volatile outburst she had banked on to complete my public humiliation in front of my logistics crew. Derek had his chin raised high, gripping his leather briefcase, trying desperately to project the intimidating aura of a high-powered corporate attorney instead of the glorified real estate hustler he actually was. Mitch was smirking, leaning casually against the yellow safety rail, chewing on a toothpick like a common street thug. They were so incredibly confident in their absolute victory. They thought the silence stretching between us was the sound of my spirit breaking. They did not understand it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Suddenly, the massive steel blast doors leading from the corporate administrative wing slammed open. The heavy metallic impact echoed like a sharp thunderclap across the cavernous concrete distribution center. The aggressive sound cut right through the mechanical hum of the idling forklifts and the pneumatic hissing of the loading dock hydraulics. Every single blue-collar worker on the massive floor stopped what they were doing and turned their heads toward the administrative stairwell. Harrison Cole, our chief executive officer, stepped out into the harsh industrial light. He was not alone. Flanking him on his right was Marcus Vance, the ruthless general counsel of our billion-dollar logistics empire. Behind them marched four incredibly broad-shouldered men, wearing immaculate dark suits and discreet communication earpieces. This was the elite corporate security detail. They moved with a synchronized militaristic precision that instantly changed the atmospheric pressure of the entire building. This was not a routine managerial termination. This was a highly coordinated tactical strike. Harrison raised his right hand and made two swift, deliberate gestures. The security team immediately broke formation without a single word spoken. They fanned out across the warehouse floor, moving with terrifying speed and absolute purpose. 2 men secured the bottom of the administrative stairwell, blocking the path back up to the executive suites. 1 man marched directly to the side emergency exit, standing firmly in front of the push bar. The largest of the 4 men walked straight to the main visitor entrance, pulled a heavy set of keys from his belt, and locked the reinforced steel doors with a loud, definitive clack. He dropped the keys into his pocket and crossed his massive arms. The warehouse was officially locked down. The perimeter was completely secured. Nobody was getting out. Brenda turned her head and noticed Harrison striding purposefully across the concrete floor. Her entire demeanor instantly shifted from vicious predator to fragile victim. She quickly straightened her expensive red designer jacket and plastered a look of tragic relief across her face. She actually believed Harrison was marching down to the warehouse floor to personally hand me my termination papers. She thought the chief executive officer had come to publicly execute my career and validate her fabricated lies. Harrison walked up the metal stairs to the dispatch platform, his polished shoes ringing sharply against the grating. Brenda took a step toward him, opening her mouth to speak. She reached out her hand, preparing to thank him for saving her from her supposedly abusive, dangerous husband. Harrison did not even blink. He walked right past her as if she were completely invisible. He did not acknowledge her outstretched hand. He did not look at her tragic, pleading face. He stepped right up to the front of my dispatch console and stood shoulder to shoulder with me. Marcus Vance marched up the stairs right behind him, standing firmly on my other side. Together we formed an impenetrable physical wall of corporate authority. Brenda lowered her hand, her face flushing with sudden confusion. Derek shifted his weight nervously, gripping his leather briefcase a little tighter. The smug, arrogant smirk on Mitch's face slowly began to fade, replaced by a subtle, creeping uncertainty. Harrison looked down at Derek, staring at him with cold, analytical eyes. "You must be the legal counsel," Harrison said, his voice carrying a dangerous, icy edge that commanded instant respect. Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. "Yes, sir," Derek replied, trying to keep his voice deep and steady. "I am representing Mrs. Hayes in this deeply unfortunate domestic and financial matter." Harrison did not reply. He pulled a sleek black corporate smartphone from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He reached over the top of my dispatch desk and grabbed a thick, coiled audio cable. It was a direct auxiliary line wired straight into the massive public address system we used for emergency warehouse broadcasts and building-wide safety announcements. Harrison plugged the heavy metal jack directly into his phone. A brief, sharp screech of electronic feedback blasted through the dozens of heavy-duty industrial speakers suspended from the steel rafters high above our heads. 200 dock workers, drivers, and shift supervisors stood completely frozen on the concrete floor below us, looking up at the platform in absolute silence. Harrison looked at me and gave a single respectful nod. Then he slowly turned his head and locked his piercing blue eyes directly onto Brenda. "Before you sign anything," Calvin Harrison boomed, his voice raw and commanding, completely filling the massive warehouse without needing a microphone. "I think your wife's legal counsel needs to hear exactly what kind of evidence we review at this corporation." Harrison tapped the glowing screen of his smartphone. The entire distribution center was suddenly flooded with the loud, crackling static of an audio file being aggressively amplified to industrial volumes. Then came the heavy pounding bass of nightclub music and the sharp clinking of cocktail glasses. The ambient noise bounced off the corrugated steel roof, creating an incredibly immersive soundscape. And then Derek's voice echoed like roaring thunder across the freezing concrete floor. "Hey, baby!" The giant speakers blared, dripping with an unbearable, sloppy, drunken arrogance. "Just sitting here celebrating at the lounge. I know you said you were turning your phone off for the weekend to deal with the old man, but I just had to call and hear your voice. I am looking at the business account right now. You are an absolute genius, Brenda. The entire $91,000 from your old man's corporate account cleared perfectly. We are rich, baby. He is completely wiped out, and he does not even have a clue. Enjoy your night. I will see you when you get back. The color instantly drained from Derek's face. His tanned skin turned the shade of wet ash. His jaw dropped completely open, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. He stared at the smartphone in Harrison's hand as if it were an explosive device. Brenda stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the metal grating of the platform. She grabbed the yellow safety rail to steady herself, shaking her head in frantic denial. No. She gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence of the warehouse. That is a mistake. That is fabricated. But Harrison was not done. He tapped his screen a second time. This time the speakers broadcasted the crisp, high-definition audio from the hidden dashcam I had retrieved from her luxury vehicle. Brenda's own voice filled the massive industrial space, perfectly clear and undeniably damning. He drained his retirement just like we planned. The speakers broadcasted Brenda's voice echoing down every single aisle of the distribution center. The old fool actually cried when he told me I was safe. The sound of her cruel, mocking laughter poured out of the overhead speakers. It was a vile, wicked sound that painted the absolute darkest corners of her soul for everyone to see. Then the audio shifted to her laying out the final vicious stage of her strategy. I am going to his warehouse next Friday, the recorded voice of my wife boasted to the entire facility. I am going to walk right onto that dusty logistics floor in the middle of his shift. I am going to serve him the divorce papers right in front of his entire crew. Every single forklift driver, every shift supervisor, every blue-collar guy who looks up to him is going to watch me drop those papers on his desk. I need to break his spirit completely. Harrison tapped the screen one final time, and the audio abruptly cut off, plunging the massive building back into a profound, terrifying silence. 200 hard-working men stood completely motionless. These were men who had known me for decades. These were men I had mentored, men I had protected from corporate layoffs, men whose families I had asked about every single morning. They heard the pure, concentrated evil dripping from my wife's voice. They heard her explicitly state her intention to humiliate me and destroy my dignity in front of them. The collective anger radiating from the warehouse floor was palpable. You could feel the heavy, dangerous heat rising from the dock workers. They glared up at the platform, their faces hardened with absolute disgust. Brenda looked around frantically. Her pristine crimson-red power suit suddenly looked like a cheap, pathetic costume. The manufactured confidence that had carried her through the front doors was entirely shattered. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. But I gave her nothing. I stood there adjusting the lapels of my faded work jacket, my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. Derek, however, was the first one to truly break. He was a commercial broker. He understood the lethal reality of corporate law. He realized in one blinding flash of terror that leaving a recorded voicemail on a billionaire executive's corporate server, explicitly confessing to taking unauthorized corporate funds, was a massive federal offense. He realized he was standing in a room with the general counsel of a logistics empire, and he had just essentially handed them a signed confession for wire fraud. The heavy leather briefcase slipped directly through his sweaty, trembling fingers. It slammed hard onto the metal grating of the platform, popping open on impact. There were no complex legal briefs inside. There were no official court documents or heavily researched corporate lawsuits. A stack of completely blank printer paper spilled out, scattering across the metal stairs and fluttering down onto the concrete floor below. He was an absolute fraud playing dress-up, and the illusion had just been violently shattered. Derek threw both of his hands high up in the air, stepping completely away from Brenda, as if she were suddenly highly radioactive. "It was her idea," Derek screamed, his voice cracking high and shrill in a state of absolute blind panic. "I am not a part of any corporate extortion. I did not threaten anyone. She forced me to do it. She told me the money was perfectly clean. She told me it was a legitimate personal loan. She set the whole thing up from the very beginning. I had absolutely nothing to do with calling the executive office." Brenda snapped her head toward her young lover, her jaw trembling in pure shock at his immediate and total betrayal. "Derek," she pleaded, reaching a shaking hand out toward him, "what are you doing? You promised we were a team. You said we were building a future. I am not going to federal prison for you, Brenda." Derek shouted, backing away until his spine hit the safety railing. "You lied to me. You dragged me into a corporate fraud investigation. I am absolutely done with you." The young shark, the man who had stood in my kitchen, drinking my expensive scotch and mocking my blue-collar life, was now actively weeping, throwing the woman he supposedly loved directly under the wheels of the nearest bus to save his own skin. It was a pathetic, miserable display of cowardice. But the most satisfying retreat belonged to Mitch, the sleazy debt collector who had spent 20 years looking down his nose at my honest labor, suddenly realized the true gravity of his situation. He was not just standing in a dusty warehouse. He was standing in the absolute center of a massive federal conspiracy that he had actively helped design. He knew the corporate lawyers flanking me were about to dispatch investigators to dissect every single shady transaction his dirty little collection agency had ever processed. Mitch did not say a single word to his sister. He did not step forward to defend her honor or shield her from the disaster. His face was slick with a greasy, terrified sweat. He slowly turned around, keeping his head incredibly low, trying desperately to blend into the dark shadows of the towering pallet racks. He crept down the metal stairs, his cheap shoes squeaking frantically against the grating. As soon as his boots hit the concrete floor, he broke into a dead sprint. He ran down the wide central aisle, shoving past a stationary forklift, making a desperate, frantic dash for the main visitor exit. He thought he could just slip away into the afternoon traffic and disappear back into his miserable life. I watched him reach the heavy reinforced steel door. He grabbed the handle and yanked it with all of his pathetic might. The heavy industrial door did not budge a single millimeter. He rattled the handle frantically, throwing his bony shoulder against the steel, panting like a cornered, terrified rat trapped inside a sinking ship. From behind a massive stack of shrink-wrapped wooden crates, the largest corporate security guard stepped out into the open aisle. He walked up behind the panicking debt collector, moving with a slow, terrifying grace. The guard reached out with one massive hand and grabbed the back of Mitch's cheap gray suit collar, effortlessly lifting him an inch off the ground and pinning him flat against the cold concrete block wall. Mitch let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper, completely going limp in the security guard's grasp. The warehouse was completely silent once again, save for the soft mechanical hum of the ceiling fans and the sharp, ragged sound of Brenda's hyperventilating breaths. The predators who had marched into my sanctuary expecting an easy slaughter were now entirely caught in the snare. The illusion of their superiority was completely, utterly broken. I looked at Brenda, watching the tears of genuine, absolute terror finally ruin her flawless makeup. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the pure, clean satisfaction of absolute justice taking deep, permanent root in the very floorboards of the kingdom I had built. The echo of Derek's pathetic, cowardly betrayal still hung heavily in the thick industrial air of the distribution center. Brenda stood completely paralyzed on the metal dispatch platform. Her expensive, tailored crimson-red suit looked entirely absurd now. She looked exactly like a highly decorated general, who had just realized her entire army had willingly deserted her on the actual battlefield. She turned her head slowly, looking with wide, terrified eyes at the massive steel doors of the administrative stairwell. The heavy door slowly swung open one more time. Two men stepped out onto the upper landing and began to walk down the metal steps. They were not wearing yellow safety vests, and they were not wearing tailored corporate suits. They wore plain, inconspicuous clothing with heavy, dark utility belts clipped around their waists. I knew exactly who they were because Harrison and I had been sitting in his private glass office with them for the past hour. They were plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes Division of the police department. The heavy thud of their boots against the metal grating sounded like a slow, steady drumbeat of absolute doom. Brenda stumbled backward until her spine hit the edge of my scarred metal desk. She looked at the two detectives, and then she looked at Harrison Cole. Her mind was frantically trying to process how her flawless, sinister plan had miraculously transformed into a catastrophic federal nightmare. Harrison stood perfectly still with his hands resting casually in his pockets, projecting the quiet, dominant authority of a man who owned the entire building. He gave the lead detective a single sharp nod. Brenda Hayes, the taller detective, said, his voice a low, commanding baritone that carried easily across the silent warehouse floor. "You and Derek Mitchell are officially under arrest for suspected wire fraud, corporate extortion, and conspiracy to commit grand theft." The words hit the concrete floor like heavy iron anvils. Derek let out a loud, pathetic sob, immediately dropping to his expensive suit knees. He raised his manicured hands in the air, openly weeping and begging the detectives to listen to him. He practically screamed that he was completely innocent, that Brenda had orchestrated the entire financial scheme, that she had manipulated him into opening the joint account. The slick, arrogant commercial real estate broker who had proudly stood in my kitchen, drinking my expensive imported scotch, was now reduced to a blubbering, terrified child. The second detective simply reached down, grabbed Derek roughly by the shoulder, and hauled him back to his feet, violently, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire 35-year career. Brenda did not fall to her knees. She remained standing completely rigid, staring at the shiny silver handcuffs the lead detective was slowly pulling from his utility belt. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. She slowly turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. The arrogant, wicked woman who had confidently marched into my warehouse to publicly humiliate me and steal my paid-off house was entirely gone. In her place was a desperate, cornered animal. "Calvin," she whispered, her voice cracking and breaking under the immense weight of her absolute terror. "Calvin, please, you have to tell them this is a massive mistake. You have to tell them the money was a personal loan. Please, Calvin, I am your wife. I am your family. You promised you would always protect me." I looked at her, keeping my facial expression an unreadable mask of absolute cold calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply leaned forward slightly, placing my heavy, calloused hands on the metal railing of the dispatch platform. "You wanted an audience, Brenda," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any sorrow or pity. "You wanted to walk onto my logistics floor and break my spirit in front of my entire crew. You wanted a public spectacle to strip me of my dignity. Well, you have your audience now." The lead detective stepped forward, grabbing Brenda's wrists and pulling them firmly behind her back. She gasped loudly as the cold steel bracelets clamped down tightly, locking her into her newly manufactured reality. She began to weep openly, sobbing and struggling against the detective's grip. She begged me to forgive her. She begged Harrison to drop the corporate charges. She cried out that she was just confused and overwhelmed by debt. but nobody on that elevated platform moved a single inch to help her. "Before we transport these two individuals," Harrison said, looking directly at Derek, who was violently shivering in the grasp of the second detective, "I want to make one thing absolutely crystal clear regarding the stolen corporate funds. The bank fraud department was legally notified of your recorded voicemail confession early this morning. They immediately triggered a federal freeze on your newly established joint checking account. That $91,000 is currently locked down by federal authorities, and it is being actively routed directly back into a secure, ironclad legal trust owned entirely by Calvin Hayes." Derek let out a hollow, devastated moan. His entire business venture, his grand, arrogant startup plan, was officially completely dead. He was going to a federal holding cell, and he did not have a single stolen dime to hire a competent criminal defense attorney. He had absolutely nothing. "Take the trash out," Harrison commanded, giving the detectives a final dismissive wave of his hand. The two plainclothes detectives turned Brenda and Derek around, marching them toward the metal stairs. I stood silently on the platform, watching the woman I had fiercely loved and protected for 20 long years, being escorted away like a common street criminal. They walked them down the metal grating and out onto the massive, dusty concrete floor. 200 tough blue-collar dock workers, forklift drivers, and shift supervisors stood in absolute dead silence watching the perp walk. These hard-working men who had witnessed Brenda march into the building acting like a conquering queen now watched her stumble past them in steel handcuffs, with her designer makeup completely ruined by her own desperate tears. They did not mock her. They did not jeer or shout insults. They simply stood there radiating a quiet, heavy judgment. As the detectives walked them down the main central loading aisle, the massive crowd of working men slowly parted down the middle, creating a wide, clear path toward the main visitor exit. It was a profound, incredible display of silent respect for me. They were watching the absolute total restoration of my professional and personal dignity. Mitch, the sleazy debt-collecting brother who had tried to mastermind my destruction, was already secured in the back of a black corporate security vehicle outside, waiting to be handed over to the local authorities for his active role in the conspiracy. The entire hostile invasion force had been completely neutralized and eradicated. The heavy steel front doors of the distribution center opened, casting a final brief square of bright afternoon sunlight across the floor, and then they swung shut. The intruders were gone. The toxic poison they had tried to inject into my life had been drawn out and expelled. Harrison Cole turned to me. The harsh, cold corporate executive mask he wore for the world slightly melted away, revealing a glimpse of genuine human respect. He reached out and extended his large hand toward me. I took it, gripping his hand firmly. "You handled that with absolute perfection," Calvin, the chief executive officer, said, giving my hand a solid shake. "You kept your head completely cold under unimaginable pressure. That is exactly why you run this entire southern region. Take the rest of the week off. Take next week off as well. Go home and secure your personal life. Your job, your pension, and your corporate legal benefits are completely safe. We will handle the aggressive corporate litigation against them from here." "Thank you, sir," I replied, my voice low and thick with genuine, sincere gratitude. "I truly appreciate your loyalty to your men." Harrison nodded, turning to walk back toward the administrative stairwell, with his powerful general counsel right behind him. I stood alone on the elevated dispatch platform for a few long, quiet moments. The massive warehouse floor below me was completely still, waiting for my command. I reached down to my scarred metal desk and picked up my heavy two-way radio, clipping it securely back onto my leather belt. I leaned over the yellow safety rail, looking down at my dedicated shift supervisor. "All right, gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying strong and clear across the vast concrete expanse. "The show is officially over. We still have 3 outbound refrigerated trailers that need to hit the highway before the evening rush hour traffic begins. Let us get those dock doors open and get this freight moving. A loud, enthusiastic cheer erupted from the warehouse floor. The massive diesel engines of the forklifts roared back to life with a deafening, beautiful mechanical thunder. The bright amber warning beacons began to flash brilliantly in the dusty air. The hydraulic loading docks hissed and slammed into place. My kingdom was alive again, running with absolute flawless precision. A few hours later, the punishing sun began to set, casting long, deep orange shadows across the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My shift was finally over. I walked out to my truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood was incredibly surreal. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past week, the crushing grief, the burning anger, the intense, terrifying paranoia had all vanished entirely. My chest felt remarkably light. The tight iron band that had been restricting my lungs was gone. I felt like a man who had been drowning in a dark, freezing ocean and had finally broken the surface to take a massive, clean breath of fresh air. I pulled into my concrete driveway and put the truck in park. The brick house looked exactly the same on the outside, but everything inside had fundamentally changed. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped into the foyer. The absolute silence of the house greeted me, but this time it was not a heavy, dangerous silence. It was not the toxic quiet of a home infected by lies and betrayal. It was a profound, beautiful, peaceful silence. It was the quiet sanctuary of a man who had successfully defended his castle against the invading wolves. I took off my heavy steel toe boots, leaving them neatly by the front door. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the small amber counterlight. I reached for the glass pot, filling it with fresh cold water, and started brewing a new pot of dark roast coffee. The rich, warm, comforting scent of the roasted beans quickly filled the kitchen, pushing out the last lingering ghosts of her presence. I watched the dark liquid slowly drip into the glass pot, listening to the soft, comforting, bubbling sound of the coffee maker. I poured myself a steaming mug and walked into the living room. I sat down heavily in my worn leather recliner, letting the soft material support my tired, aching back. I took a long, slow sip of the hot, dark coffee. It tasted absolutely perfect. I looked around the empty living room, feeling a deep, powerful sense of emotional clarity wash over my soul. I had survived. I had kept my dignity completely intact. I had saved my life savings, and I was finally entirely free. To all my brothers out there, the fathers and husbands working your hands to the bone to provide, never let your love make you blind. True loyalty doesn't demand you destroy your own future to prove your worth. When the mask slips, believe what you see, keep your head cold, and fight back smart. If my story gave you a little strength today, please hit that like button to support a man who took his life back. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next life story. And tell me in the comments, what city and state are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing where my brothers and sisters are tuning in from. Stay strong, stay wise, and God bless.